For most of human history, a child surviving under the care of only two exhausted adults would have been a fragile arrangement, not the human norm. Our species emerged in small communities where food, attention, protection, memory, and daily care were often spread across many hands, many ages, and many overlapping bonds. The modern image of childhood as a closed unit may feel familiar, but in evolutionary time it is unusually narrow. If human childhood was shaped inside a wider circle of care, why were humans never raised by just two parents? A modern child is often imagined inside a small frame, one home, one mother, one father, perhaps a bedroom, a kitchen, a school bag near the door. It feels so ordinary that many people barely notice it as an idea at all. It seems less like a cultural arrangement and more like a natural fact. Yet if we step back from the habits of the present and place human childhood inside the much longer story of our species, that small frame begins to look unusually narrow. For most of human history, human life did not unfold inside sealed private households set apart from a wider world. It unfolded in groups, in shared spaces, in camps, in settlements, in places where sound, work, food, danger, memory, and attention moved across many people at once. That does not mean every child was equally loved by every adult, or that all communities were gentle places. It means only that the daily conditions in which human beings evolved were rarely built around the idea that two adults alone could carry the full weight of raising a child from birth to maturity. The question becomes clearer when we return to the beginning of human life itself. A human baby arrives not as a nearly finished creature, but as one of the most dependent young mammals on Earth. It cannot cling like a young ape, cannot walk, cannot feed itself, cannot regulate much of its own life without close support. This deep helplessness is not a small detail at the edge of the story. It is one of the central facts of being human. From the start, our species made a difficult bargain. Large brains, slow development, long learning, and prolonged dependence. That bargain did not create a short, simple childhood that could easily fit inside the labor limits of two tired adults. It created a form of life that demanded time, patience, carrying, feeding, watching, teaching, and repeated protection over many years. Even before agriculture, before cities, before written law, this burden would already have existed. In the world of mobile foragers and small bands, survival depended on movement, food gathering, tool use, vigilance, knowledge of terrain, and constant adjustment to season and risk. In such settings, care could not always remain fixed in the hands of the same two people every hour of the day. Someone had to search for food, someone had to maintain fire, someone had to notice weather, injury, predators, strangers, or the needs of other children. A child born into that kind of world was not entering a private emotional unit. That child was entering a living human field made of overlapping bodies, tasks, and generations. This is why the modern two-parent image can be misleading even when it feels emotionally powerful. It invites us to imagine that the smaller unit is the original one, and that anything beyond it is extra help added later. But the deeper historical possibility may be closer to the reverse. The wider circle may have come first, while the isolated household is the compressed form that arrived much later under very different material conditions. Anthropologists use terms like cooperative breeding or alloparenting to describe this broader sharing of care, but the basic insight is simple enough without specialized language. Human children seem to have been shaped in social worlds where care often moved beyond the biological mother and father alone, not because parents did not matter, but because parents were usually embedded in a larger human structure. The familiar modern household may still be meaningful, loving, and real, but once placed against the long background of human origins, it begins to look less like the design of our species, and more like one recent way of organizing a much older human need. The more familiar the modern household becomes, the easier it is to mistake it for a timeless human pattern. A child today may be described through a short list of close relations, and daily life may be organized around the schedule, income, energy, and emotional resources of just two adults. Yet this arrangement depends on material conditions that are historically unusual. Permanent walls, stored food, separated rooms, regulated work hours, and institutions that can take over parts of care for portions of the day. None of these conditions define the long beginning of human life. For most of the human past, The places where children grew up were not sharply divided into private domestic interiors and an outer public world. The living space itself was more open, more shared, and more porous. People slept near one another, moved together, ate together, watched one another's children, and adjusted to the needs of the group as a whole. Under those conditions, attention was not neatly owned. It circulated. So did knowledge, warning, comfort, discipline, and practical help. This matters because human childhood is not only long, it is also demanding in a very particular way. Human young need constant social input. They learn faces, voices, gestures, rhythms, emotional cues, objects, and routines through repeated contact with many kinds of people over many years. The origins of our species lie not in isolation, but in dense social dependence. A child does not simply need calories and shelter. A child needs carrying, soothing, imitation, correction, language, protection from accidents, and gradual introduction into the skills of the group. In an early human setting, those skills were not abstract school subjects waiting for a later age. They were the actual pattern of survival: where to step, what to avoid, how to handle a tool, when to remain quiet, how to notice smoke, weather, animals, water, and the moods of other people. This kind of learning could unfold only inside a social field larger than a pair bond. Even when a mother and father were central figures, the child's world would still have been filled with other bodies and other eyes. A nearby older child might interrupt danger. A grandparent might hold, distract, or calm. Another adult might share food, carry the infant, or demonstrate some repeated motion that later became memory. None of this requires romanticizing the past. Human groups could be harsh, unstable, and limited by hunger, illness, and loss. But harshness does not erase shared structure. In fact, difficult conditions often make distributed care more necessary, not less. When one adult is injured, absent, lactating, pregnant, gathering, or sleeping, another can briefly take over part of the burden. That flexibility may have been one of the quiet supports that made human childhood possible in the first place. This is also where the beginning of our species becomes important again. Human beings did not emerge with short childhoods and easy independence, later choosing community as a cultural preference. The deeper pattern appears to be the opposite. Because human young were so slow to mature, and because adult survival demanded time and labor, wider participation in care would have carried clear advantages. The child was never only an emotional project of two individuals. The child was also a social investment inside a group that depended on continuity across generations. From that longer view, the small modern household stops looking like the basic human template. It begins to look like a narrow container trying to hold a form of childhood that was shaped under wider, older, and more collective conditions. What feels normal in one century can be structurally strange in the history of a species. The two-parent household often appears to modern eyes as the smallest complete unit of childhood, almost like a biological fact reduced to its cleanest form. Yet the longer human record suggests something more complex. Human children are not only born dependent, they remain dependent for an unusually long time, and that dependence is not limited to food or physical safety. It includes learning how to become human inside a specific group. Language, gesture, restraint, memory, imitation, emotional tone, shared attention, and practical skill all take shape slowly, through repetition, over years. In the deep beginning of our species, those repetitions almost certainly happened in the presence of more than two people. This is not because every community was harmonious, and not because the past should be imagined as one large family without conflict. It is because the design of human development seems to fit a world in which many people were nearby, visible, audible, and involved to different degrees. One way to see this more clearly is to compare human young to the rhythm of adult work. In early human environments, adults could not devote every hour to direct childcare. Life demanded movement, vigilance, food processing, fire tending, tool repair, water carrying, observation of season and place, and response to sudden risk. The beginning of human life unfolded under these conditions for far longer than it has unfolded under the conditions of modern homes. If childhood had truly been designed around the full-time, nearly exclusive care of two adults, then the ordinary pressures of foraging life would have made that design difficult to sustain. But if childhood emerged inside a wider web of attention, then the picture becomes more coherent. A baby could be held by one person, watched by another, soothed by another voice, and carried through a social world rather than kept at its edge. A slightly older child could absorb language not from two fixed speakers, but from a chorus of familiar mouths. A growing child could learn not from a private lesson, but from proximity to repeated actions. In this sense, human childhood may have been collective long before anyone made theories about family. The point is not that biological parents were unimportant. On the contrary, they were likely central in many ways. But central does not mean solitary. A fire can have a center while still depending on everything around it: the fuel, the air, the space, the people who keep it alive. Early human care may have worked in much the same way. The mother and father could matter deeply while still existing inside a broader structure of support, interruption, substitution, and shared burden. This helps explain why the modern narrowing of care can feel emotionally intense. It compresses into two people what may once have been distributed across a band, a camp, a cluster of kin, or a settlement. It asks a small household to meet needs that were shaped under older conditions. Returning again to human origins makes this less a social opinion than a developmental question. What kind of young does our species produce? Not the kind that can be quickly left behind, and not the kind that matures with minimal observation. Human young are slow, needy, socially open, and deeply shaped by surrounding presence. That alone does not prove exactly how every prehistoric group organized care. The evidence is never that simple. But it does suggest a broad direction. If human childhood was formed over immense stretches of time in shared living environments, then the image of one child being raised mainly by two adults may be less an ancient rule than a recent narrowing of a much older human pattern. A human baby enters the world in an unusually unfinished state. This is one of the quiet biological facts that shapes the entire question of care. Compared with many other mammals, and even compared with our closest primate relatives, human infants arrive deeply dependent, unable to move on their own, unable to feed themselves, unable to cling securely, and unable to survive without constant support. This early helplessness is not an accident at the edge of human life. It is tied to the larger pattern of what kind of species we are, a species with large brains, long development, slow learning, and an extended path to maturity. Human childhood begins early in the body, long before culture adds its own expectations. The newborn does not simply need milk and warmth. The newborn needs carrying, holding, protection from temperature, repeated soothing, close observation, and continuous response to distress. Even that is only the beginning. What follows is not a short burst of dependence, but a long stretch of gradual growth during which movement, feeding, communication, self-control, and practical understanding all emerge slowly. This matters because a species shaped this way is not easily matched with a narrow caregiving arrangement. The body of a human infant places real demands on adult time and adult energy. Feeding takes time, sleep is broken, carrying is constant. Illness and danger can arrive quickly. The child cannot simply be set down and expected to recover its own balance in the world. A great deal of human care begins with the simple fact that the human infant is not ready for independence when it is born. This returns us to the beginning of the human story. In evolutionary anthropology, this unusual dependence is often discussed together with the long human life history. Human young grow slowly, and much of that slow growth is connected to the development of the brain, the body, and the social capacities that allow humans to live in complex groups. A child is not only becoming larger, a child is becoming readable to others, responsive to others, able to learn from others, and eventually able to take a place inside a shared human world. That process takes years, not weeks. It also means that childcare was unlikely to be a brief, sealed task that two adults could always absorb without wider support. When the child is young for a long time, the burden of care is also long. When learning depends on close contact, voices, faces, gesture, and repeated correction, the social environment matters as much as the physical one. In this sense, the biology of the infant already points beyond the image of isolated parenthood, not because two parents are unimportant, but because the child produced by human evolution is unusually costly in time, attention, and responsiveness. A species that gives birth to such young is at the very least a species under pressure to distribute care in flexible ways. It is important to stay careful here. Biology does not tell us the exact form of every ancient household, and it does not prove that every prehistoric child had the same network around them. But biology does narrow what seems plausible. If human babies are this dependent, and if childhood remains this prolonged, then the full responsibility of raising them would rarely have been a light task for only two people living under difficult conditions. The point is not certainty about the details. The point is direction. The shape of the human infant suggests that our species began with a developmental problem too large to be solved by convenience alone. From the first days of life, the human child seems to belong to a form of care that is wider than a pair, slower than a season, and deeper than a private household. The strange thing about human infancy is not only how helpless it is, but how long that helplessness slowly changes form instead of disappearing. In many animals, the earliest stage of dependence is intense but brief. In humans, dependence stretches outward and becomes layered. A newborn depends through the body. A toddler depends through movement and protection. A young child depends through teaching, supervision, food access, and social guidance. Even later, dependence does not vanish all at once. It becomes less visible, but it remains built into the long road by which a human being learns how to speak well, judge danger, recognize rules, read emotion, remember places, and participate in group life. This is one of the central biological features of our species. Human young take an unusually long time to become fully capable. That long developmental arc is not separate from the question of who raised them. It is the question in biological form. A short childhood can fit inside a small window of care. A long childhood places pressure on the entire surrounding structure. The longer immaturity lasts, the more likely it is that care must be shared, interrupted, resumed, and spread across different hands over time. Two healthy and committed parents can do enormous work, of course. But human evolution did not unfold mainly under the stable conditions that modern people often imagine when picturing a household. It unfolded under fluctuating conditions where injury, pregnancy, food search, illness, movement, weather, and the needs of other children would all compete for time. Under those circumstances, the length of human childhood becomes especially important. The issue is not only that babies need much, it is that they continue to need much for a very long time. From the beginning of our species, that would have created a recurring problem. A mother recovering from birth may still be feeding one child while carrying another pregnancy. A father may be absent part of the day because survival requires distance, attention, or risk. Older children need watching too, not only infants. In such a setting, even brief moments of relief matter. Someone else holding the child, distracting the child, feeding the child, or simply watching for danger is not minor assistance. It is part of the larger structure that makes prolonged human immaturity manageable. This is why the origin point of our species matters again here. Human beings did not evolve as fast maturing creatures later placed into social complexity. We evolved with social complexity and slow maturation entangled together. The young human brain remains open and unfinished for a long time, and that openness is one reason humans can absorb language, custom, skill, and shared expectations so deeply. But an open and slow-growing child also creates a long burden of care. The very qualities that made humans flexible learners may also have made solitary or narrowly bounded child-rearing less likely as a stable ancestral pattern. This does not mean every adult in an early group was equally involved at all times. It means only that the shape of the child favors a wider ecology of care. A child who learns slowly, watches constantly, and depends for years is a child whose growth can be influenced by many nearby adults and older children, not only by two central figures. Once that is seen, the modern two-parent model begins to look less like a biological default and more like a historical compression. It may still work, and it may still feel emotionally central, but it carries within it a hidden strain. It asks a very small unit to sustain a developmental process that appears to have been shaped under broader human conditions. The biology of the child does not give us a photograph of prehistoric family life, but it does tell us something quieter and more reliable. Human childhood was built to last a long time, and anything built to last that long usually rests on more than two shoulders. The cost of a human child is measured not only in food, but in time organized around interruption. This may be one of the least dramatic, yet most revealing, facts about our species. A human infant cannot be cared for in occasional bursts, and then left to proceed alone. Care must return again and again, in broken sleep, in repeated feeding, in carrying, cleaning, soothing, protecting, and watching. Then, as the child grows, the form of that care changes without becoming simple. What was once physical holding becomes guidance. What was once feeding becomes supervision. What was once immediate protection becomes years of teaching and correction. This slow transformation from bodily dependence to social dependence is deeply human, and it is part of what makes the question of child-rearing larger than a private arrangement between two adults. At the beginning of human life, the body already tells us that the work will be long. Human infants are born in a state of remarkable vulnerability, and human childhood extends that vulnerability in new forms over many years. A young child may be able to walk, but not safely judge a landscape. A child may speak, but not yet understand risk, conflict, obligation, or the subtle rules of shared life. A child may watch skilled adults, but still need repeated demonstration before turning observation into ability. In that sense, childhood is not only a phase of weakness, it is a long apprenticeship. And apprenticeships, especially in the early human world, are difficult to imagine inside a sealed domestic unit. The beginning of our species unfolded in environments where knowledge was practical, local, and constantly needed. The shape of a stone edge, the timing of a journey, the recognition of tracks, the safe handling of fire, the reading of weather, the memory of paths, the management of water, the notice of social tension inside a group, all of these could matter. A child entering such a world had much to learn, and much of that learning would have come through presence rather than formal instruction. Presence means more than affection. It means being nearby while work is done, hearing the voices of others, noticing rhythms of cooperation, seeing different hands perform different tasks, and gradually absorbing the repeated logic of group life. Once we picture childhood this way, the notion of being raised by just two parents begins to narrow too quickly. It reduces a broad developmental process to a small emotional image. The image is not false, but it is incomplete. Two parents may stand near the center of a child's life, yet the child's actual formation can still depend on a much wider human background. This would have been especially true in the long periods before modern institutions took over parts of care. No separate school system, no scheduled childcare, no stable private interior, no guaranteed reserve of stored food across all conditions. In such a world, the child would grow not beside society, but inside it. This is why the biological story does not end with the helpless infant. The longer and more socially demanding the road to adulthood becomes, the weaker the idea of exclusive two-parent care appears as an ancestral pattern. The human child seems shaped for a world of many eyes, many voices, and repeated transfer of attention from one person to another. Not because love was evenly distributed, and not because every group functioned smoothly, but because prolonged immaturity creates repeated openings through which others become involved. The most careful conclusion is also the simplest one. Human biology does not tell us everything about prehistoric households, but it strongly suggests that the child our species produces is too slow, too demanding, and too socially shaped to fit neatly into the idea of childhood as the work of only two people. A long childhood changes the structure of a species. And 25, it changes how food must be shared, how labor must be divided, how knowledge is passed on, and how many people become necessary around the young. In humans, childhood is not simply a short interval between birth and usefulness. It is an extended condition of gradual becoming. The human child takes years to gain bodily coordination, years to master language, years to understand social rules, years to recognize danger with consistency, and even longer to approach the competence expected of an adult. This long delay is not a flaw in our design. It is part of what made humans the kind of creatures they became. A long childhood allows learning to be deep, flexible, and responsive to local conditions. But the same feature also creates a lasting burden. The longer the road to maturity, the less likely it is that care can remain simple, private, and narrowly contained. This brings us back to the origins of human life. Early humans did not raise children in an environment filled with specialized institutions. There were no classrooms separated from subsistence, no modern schedules that divided education from survival, no large systems waiting to absorb the work of watching, teaching, and correcting the young. Childhood unfolded inside daily life itself. That meant the long duration of immaturity had to be supported by the social world immediately around the child. If a human child needs many years not only to grow but to learn how to live as a member of a group, then the group becomes part of the developmental environment. The issue is larger than affection. A long childhood requires repeated presence. It requires someone to answer questions before language is fully formed, someone to interrupt unsafe behavior, someone to model tools, gestures, and routines, someone to translate the expectations of the group into habits of the body. In a species with short development, much of this pressure is reduced. In a species with long development, it accumulates. A few days of care can be managed one way. A decade or more of partial dependence is a different matter entirely. This is where the two-parent image begins to thin out under historical pressure. Two adults may be central to a child's identity, but centrality is not the same as sufficiency. If the child remains immature for years, and if adult life remains full of competing demands, then other people become more than optional helpers. They become part of the structure that keeps childhood possible. One person watches while another works. One person feeds while another rests. One person demonstrates a skill while another manages a younger sibling. Even a brief handover matters when repeated across years. The beginning of our species likely involved countless such small transfers of care, attention, and instruction. Not because prehistoric humans held a theory about shared parenting, but because long childhoods create practical needs that spread outward. The more time it takes to become human, the more humans are usually involved in that becoming. It is important not to turn this into an absolute claim. Not every child in the past would have had the same number of caregivers, and the evidence does not allow us to describe one universal arrangement in detail. But the broad logic remains strong. Human immaturity lasts a very long time, and long immaturity rarely fits comfortably inside a narrow social unit under difficult material conditions. The child, shaped by human evolution, was not a being who needed only protection in the first months and then quickly moved toward independence. The child remained unfinished across many stages. That extended unfinished state may be one of the clearest reasons humans were never formed by history, biology, and daily life to be raised by just two parents alone. The longer childhood lasts, the more it begins to shape the social world around it. This is one of the quiet pressures hidden inside human history. A species with a very short path from birth to relative independence can organize care in one way. A species whose young remain unfinished for many years must organize life differently. Human beings belong to the second kind. Our young do not simply need to survive infancy. They must pass through a prolonged period in which the body grows slowly, the mind gathers patterns gradually, and social understanding takes shape through repeated exposure to other people. That extended process changes what childhood requires. It makes care less like a temporary emergency and more like a long structure built into daily life. In the beginning of human existence, this would have mattered constantly. A child was not waiting to enter society later. The child was already inside it from the start, absorbing its rhythms before fully understanding them. This is one reason long childhood may have pulled more people into the work of raising the young. When growth takes many years, care cannot be reduced to one early phase. It keeps returning in new forms. There is the first dependence of the infant, which is almost total. Then there is the dependence of the small child, who can move but not yet judge. Then there is the dependence of the older child, who can observe but still needs correction, guidance, and example. The burden shifts, but it does not disappear. Over time, this creates a sequence of needs too extended to imagine only as a private responsibility. The longer the child remains partly dependent, the more likely it becomes that different people step in at different moments. In an early human setting, that stepping in would not necessarily have been a special event. It may simply have been part of ordinary life. One person continues a task while another keeps a child close. One person answers a cry while another prepares food. One person demonstrates a repeated motion while a child watches beside them. Childhood becomes distributed not because anyone announces a system, but because the length of human development makes narrow containment difficult. This also changes how learning itself should be imagined. Human children do not become competent through a single transfer of instruction from parent to child. Much of human learning appears to come through long observation, imitation, repetition, and gradual participation in shared routines. In the distant environments where our species took shape, those routines were woven into collective existence. A child hearing many voices, watching many hands, and seeing many ages move through the same space would have been learning far more than isolated information. That child would have been learning what it feels like to belong to a human group. Long childhood therefore does two things at once. It prolongs material dependence, and it deepens social dependence. A child needs food and protection for years, but also needs a long surrounding world of examples. Once this is recognized, the title question becomes more precise. The point is not merely that two parents may become tired. The deeper point is that the kind of child human evolution produced may have been shaped in an environment too socially rich, too prolonged, and too demanding to fit easily inside the idea of two adults acting alone. We should still remain careful. Long childhood does not prove one single family form across all places and times. Human societies have always varied. But the broad pattern remains persuasive. If children stay dependent for many years, and if the skills of adult life take a long time to acquire, then the raising of children naturally begins to extend beyond a pair. A long childhood does not simply make parenting harder. It makes childhood itself more collective in its likely human setting. A long childhood does not only delay adulthood, it changes what adulthood must do. This may be one of the most important things to understand about human life. When the young of a species remain unfinished for many years, adults cannot organize their lives only around their own immediate survival. They must also carry the slow unfinishedness of the next generation for a very long time. In humans, that unfinishedness is not minor. It stretches across the body, the mind, memory, language, judgment, emotional control, and practical skill. A child may grow taller year by year, yet still remain far from adult competence. That means the true weight of childhood is spread across a long historical rhythm, not concentrated in a few early months. From the beginning of our species, this would have shaped the way groups lived together. A long childhood creates a long obligation, and long obligations rarely stay contained inside the smallest possible social unit. This is where the question of origins becomes especially useful. If we imagine early humans in mobile groups, shared camps, or small settlements, then daily life was already full of demands that competed for adult attention. Food had to be found and processed. Water had to be reached and carried. Fire had to be maintained. Tools had to be repaired. The sick had to be watched. The weather had to be read. Paths, seasons, animals, and the moods of other people had to be noticed. In that world, a child's development was unfolding inside a field of constant necessity. The child still needed protection, teaching, supervision, and repeated contact, but adult time was never unlimited. Under those conditions, the longer childhood lasted, the stronger the pressure for care to be shared. Not necessarily equally, not always warmly, and not according to one fixed plan, but shared in practice. A long childhood also means that one child is rarely the only child. Across many human settings, adults would have cared not for a single dependent young person in isolation, but for several young people at different stages of growth. One infant might need feeding, another child might need carrying, another might be old enough to walk, yet still young enough to wander into danger or misuse a tool. The structure of care becomes even heavier when dependency overlaps this way. The issue is no longer whether two parents matter. Of course they matter. The issue is whether two people alone, across long periods and under difficult conditions, form the most plausible ancestral container for all that work. The longer childhood remains, the less likely that seems. What becomes more plausible is a broad human environment in which the burden moves. It moves across hours, across tasks, across generations, and across nearby bodies. A child sits near one worker, sleeps near another, learns by watching several, and receives correction from more than one voice. This wider arrangement may have been less a cultural invention than a practical response to the kind of creature a human child is. The child is slow to finish, open to influence, hungry for attention, and vulnerable for years. A long childhood, therefore, turns society itself into part of the developmental system. The group is not merely around the child. The group becomes one of the conditions through which the child becomes fully human. This helps us avoid a common mistake. People often imagine that shared care is an optional addition to parenting, something helpful but secondary. In the longer history of our species, the opposite may be closer to the truth. Shared care may not have been an extra layer added onto an already complete two-parent design. It may have been part of the older background that made human childhood workable at all. The most careful conclusion remains open, but it is powerful enough. Human beings have a childhood so long, so gradual, and so demanding that the child at the center of it seems to belong naturally to more than two adults, even when two adults remain central within that wider circle. For most of human history, children did not grow up inside the kind of enclosed household that feels familiar today. They grew up inside living spaces that were harder to separate into neat categories such as private and public, family and outside world, parents and everyone else. In small bands, temporary camps, and early settlements, daily life was more exposed, more shared, and more overlapping. Sleeping, eating, working, repairing, speaking, and watching often happened within sight or hearing of other people. This does not mean there was no intimacy, no pair bond, and no sense of close relation. It means that the environment itself made strict separation difficult. A child born into such a place was not entering a quiet domestic unit sealed off from the group. That child was entering a human landscape where many presences were constantly near. This matters because the shape of a living environment influences the shape of care. In a modern home, walls, doors, separate rooms, scheduled institutions, and private routines help define who is responsible at each moment. In a more open and collectively organized environment, responsibility can blur and move. One adult may be gathering something while still listening for a child. Another may be occupied with food preparation while an older sibling notices danger first. Another may share a sleeping space or sit within reach during an ordinary task. Care, in such a world, is not always announced. It is often woven into proximity. The child is not necessarily passed through a formal system of caregivers. The child simply grows where many people already are. This is one reason the beginning of human life is important here. Early humans lived in environments where survival demanded cooperation not only in dramatic moments, but in ordinary ones. Fire had to be kept alive. Food had to be found, shared, processed, and protected. Movement had to be coordinated. Risks had to be noticed before they became fatal. Under these conditions, living together was not merely a social preference. It was often a practical necessity. And when people live together in that way, children absorb the consequences. They are seen by more eyes, heard by more ears, interrupted by more hands, and exposed to more voices than a tightly sealed household would provide. The structure of the environment itself begins to resist the idea that childhood belongs only to two adults. A child sleeping near several bodies, waking to multiple voices and spending the day amid shared work is already inside a wider circle of formation. Even if the mother and father remain emotionally central, the child's actual development is taking place in a broader field. The field includes those who feed, those who warn, those who demonstrate, those who make room, and those who simply remain nearby often enough to matter. It is important not to romanticize this. Open living does not mean gentle living. Shared spaces can also mean conflict, scarcity, noise, illness, tension, and unequal burdens, but even difficulty strengthens the point. In harsh environments, the line between direct and indirect care becomes thinner. A person protecting fire may also be protecting the child from cold. A person carrying water may also be making the camp safer for everyone in it. A person telling a story near the fire may also be shaping the attention and memory of the young who listen. Once childhood is placed inside this kind of world, the modern image of one child being raised mainly inside the labor and emotional range of two adults begins to look historically narrow. The question is no longer only who loved the child most. The deeper question is what kind of living arrangement surrounded the child for most of our species' existence. And the answer seems to point not to isolation, but to nearness, overlap, and shared human space. In an open living environment, childhood is shaped not only by who intends to care, but by who is physically present often enough to matter. This difference may seem small at first, yet it changes the entire structure of early human life. In a modern setting, care is usually imagined as something assigned. A specific adult is in charge, a specific room belongs to the child, a specific routine separates family life from the wider world. But for much of human history, life did not unfold through such clear partitions. People lived close to one another, worked near one another, and depended on shared awareness in ways that made the child visible to many people at once. That visibility alone begins to widen the field of care. A child who can be seen by several adults is not in the same social condition as a child hidden inside a private domestic boundary. The first child is more exposed, but also more surrounded. This kind of surrounding presence would have mattered deeply in the environments where human beings first took shape. In mobile groups and small camps, ordinary life was conducted near the same fire, along the same paths, within the same shifting circle of tasks. The movements of adults were linked to the movements of the group. Food gathering, tool use, resting, carrying, sorting, speaking, and watching were not always split into isolated compartments. As a result, children were likely to spend much of their time close to ongoing human activity. They would not need to be invited into social life later, because social life was already the setting in which they existed. A child near grinding, carrying, repairing, watching, and talking is receiving more than supervision. That child is being formed by the repeated presence of human coordination. This is another way the beginning of our species returns to the center of the question. If human childhood emerged under conditions where people lived and worked in visible relation to one another, then the child's growth was never simply located inside the emotional bond of two adults. It was also located in the arrangement of space itself. Space can distribute care before anyone speaks about values. A fire in the center gathers bodies. A shared sleeping area increases notice. A cluster of tasks keeps people within hearing distance. The child in such a setting does not belong to an isolated domestic island. The child is folded into a human environment where interruption, response, correction, and comfort can come from more than one direction. This does not erase the difference between primary and secondary caregivers. It only makes clear that early human life likely offered fewer clean edges between them. The same adult who is not a parent may still notice a cry, redirect a dangerous movement, offer food, or become a repeated model for speech, gesture, or work. Even older children may become part of this environment by staying nearby, imitating adults, and at the same time helping to hold the attention of those younger than themselves. In this kind of setting, care becomes cumulative. No single act proves a system, but many small acts, repeated across days and years, create the actual architecture of childhood. That is why it matters that human origins lie in shared space rather than private enclosure. A long, dependent, socially hungry childhood placed inside visible group life will naturally absorb many influences and many moments of support. Once that becomes clear, the modern two-parent household appears less like the starting shape of human development and more like a later form that narrows a wider ancestral background. The child may still know certain adults as closest, but the conditions that make development possible are already extending beyond them. When people live in shared space, a child does not experience care as a single channel. Care arrives through a pattern of nearness. One person may feed, another may notice, another may make room by adjusting a task, lowering a voice, shifting an object, or moving a tool out of reach. Much of this would barely be described as childcare in a modern sense, yet it still helps form the actual conditions in which a child survives and learns. This is why space matters so much in the older human story. The shape of the environment can widen the circle of care even before anyone decides to widen it. In the long beginning of our species, this wider arrangement was likely built into ordinary life. Small human groups had to organize themselves around practical realities: warmth, access to food, movement through landscape, protection from danger, and the repeated demands of daily maintenance. Those realities did not leave much room for a sharply sealed domestic world in which one child remained under the nearly exclusive attention of two adults. Instead, life appears more plausibly as a field of overlapping presences, where tasks happen close together and where children remained close to the same shared centre of activity. A child in that world would be carried through a stream of human sounds, gestures, warnings, habits, and routines. The child would not only be receiving direct attention, the child would also be learning from the background structure of the group. This matters because human development is unusually open to background structure. A young human being learns not only from formal correction, but from repeated exposure. Tone of voice, timing of movement, use of tools, rhythms of eating, ways of sitting, moments of caution, patterns of cooperation. Even the spacing between bodies can all become part of what the child gradually absorbs. In a more isolated household, many of those influences are narrowed. In a shared human setting, they multiply. The child's growth, therefore, becomes hard to separate from the broader social environment. Two parents may remain central figures, but central figures are not the whole environment. The environment includes all those whose repeated presence becomes part of the child's world. This is especially important when we return to the question of origins. Human beings did not evolve in silent, separated interiors. They emerged across immense spans of time in conditions where group life was materially important. A child raised in proximity to many others would have had access not only to extra hands, but to extra models of adult behavior. One person might be patient, another might be stern. One might carry skill in tool use. Another might carry memory of place. One may calm through voice, another may correct through gesture. Over time, the child is not merely attached to one pair of caretakers. The child is becoming calibrated to a larger human world. That does not mean all such worlds were stable or nurturing. Scarcity, illness, conflict, and loss were always possible. But instability itself can strengthen the case that narrow care would have been difficult to rely on. When life is uncertain, the presence of multiple nearby people does not guarantee safety, yet it can increase resilience. If one adult is absent, occupied, ill, recovering, or temporarily overwhelmed, the child is still inside a social field where others may notice and respond. This kind of flexibility may have mattered enormously across the long duration of human childhood. Once the child is placed back into this older landscape of shared living, the title of the video begins to sound less like a modern opinion and more like a historical and biological question with real weight. Humans may not have been raised by just two parents because the spaces in which human childhood first became possible were already larger than that. Raising a human child has always depended on more than affection. It has depended on labor. This is one of the simplest and hardest facts in the history of our species. A child needs warmth, carrying, food, watching, cleaning, soothing, protection, and time. None of these appear by themselves. They come from bodies already under pressure from other demands. In the long early history of human life, those demands were constant. Food had to be found, gathered, hunted, processed, shared, and protected. Water had to be reached and carried. Fire had to be maintained. Tools had to be made, repaired, and kept ready. Shelter, whether temporary or more stable, had to be managed against weather and risk. Under such conditions, the question is not only who loved the child, but who had enough available labor to keep the child alive while the work of survival continued. This is where the idea of two parents raising a child alone begins to look especially narrow. Even in the modern world, care and labor are often in tension. In the deeper human past, that tension would have been much stronger. A mother feeding an infant could not at the same time move freely over long distances or perform every necessary task. A father seeking food, tracking animals, carrying materials, or responding to danger could not always remain physically present. If the whole burden of child-rearing rested only on those two bodies, then every interruption in labor would threaten care, and every interruption in care would threaten survival. The more demanding the environment, the less stable that arrangement becomes. This does not require dramatic scenes to make the point. Ordinary life is enough. Someone must prepare edible food. Someone must notice weather changes. Someone must keep dangerous objects or places away from the young. Someone must respond when a child cries during another task that cannot simply be abandoned. The origin of our species matters here because early human life was not organized around spare time. It was organized around ongoing necessity. In such a world, labor could not be separated neatly from childcare, and childcare could not be separated neatly from labor. The two had to overlap. That overlap opens the door to wider participation. One person may be working while also keeping a child within sight. Another may pause a task to take over briefly. Another may carry a child during movement from one place to another. Another may share food that reduces the pressure on the primary caregivers. A child survives not only because two parents work hard, but because the labor surrounding the child is distributed across a larger human setting. This becomes even clearer when we remember that early human groups often included more than one dependent child at once. One infant may need feeding while another needs watching, and another still needs guidance away from danger. No single task disappears simply because a child requires attention. Fire still goes out if no one tends it. Water still must be carried. Food still must be processed. Tools still wear down. These pressures create a structural problem, not a moral one. The problem is that human survival work is too continuous, and human childhood is too demanding to fit easily inside the uninterrupted labor of only two adults. Once we see that, wider care begins to look less like generosity and more like practicality. The child becomes part of a labor system in which many acts, some direct and some indirect, support growth. A person preparing food may also be feeding the child. A person guarding the group may also be protecting the child. A person freeing a parent's hands for even a short time may be making care possible in that moment. From the perspective of human origins, this may have been one of the deepest reasons children were rarely raised by just two parents alone. The work required to keep a child alive was embedded inside the work required to keep the group alive, and group survival has never rested on only two people. The labor behind childhood is easy to overlook because much of it leaves no monument. It vanishes into finished meals, quieted cries, carried bodies, repaired tools, safer sleeping spaces, and dangers that never fully arrive because someone noticed them in time. Yet this invisible labor may be one of the strongest clues in the entire question. A human child does not merely require love in the abstract. A human child requires repeated acts that consume time, strength, and attention every single day. In the long early history of our species, these acts would have taken place in environments where adult effort was already committed to survival. That is why labor matters so much here. It turns the question of who raised children into a question about what sort of human arrangement could realistically sustain both care and subsistence at once. A narrow arrangement begins to look fragile under that pressure. Imagine the rhythm of ordinary life rather than dramatic crisis. Food must still be collected or prepared. Water must still be obtained. Fire must still be watched. Tools must still be maintained. Bodies must still travel, rest, recover, and respond to changing conditions. Then place into that rhythm a child who cannot be left safely alone. A child who interrupts sleep. A child who must be carried, calmed, cleaned, protected, and gradually taught. The problem is not occasional difficulty. The problem is repetition. Human care does not arrive once. It returns again and again, often at the exact moment another task becomes necessary. This is where the conditions at the beginning of human life become so important. Early human groups did not live with the strong separation modern people often assume between productive labor and domestic care. The same day could require movement, gathering, processing, watching, and child supervision all at once. A child might need feeding while adults are still occupied with food work. A child might drift toward danger while a necessary tool is being repaired. A child might cry during travel, during cold, during fatigue, during the preparation of shelter, during the management of another child's needs. Under those conditions, the labor of care could not depend only on uninterrupted availability from two adults. It needed flexibility. It needed substitution. It needed nearby people able to step in briefly or repeatedly. This is one reason the human past likely leaned toward wider circles of practical support. When labor is constant and childhood is long, even a short transfer of responsibility matters. Someone holds the child so another person can use both hands. Someone watches the fire so another can soothe or feed. Someone shares prepared food that reduces strain on a mother or father. Someone notices risk first. Someone keeps an older child occupied while a younger one demands immediate care. None of these acts alone defines a whole system, but together they show how child-rearing can become distributed through the ordinary demands of shared life. From the perspective of human origins, this makes sense. Human beings evolved as creatures whose survival depended on cooperation in many domains, and childhood was not separate from those domains. A child was not a private project placed beside group life. The child was embedded inside it. The work of raising the young was partly visible in direct caregiving, but also hidden inside every action that preserved the wider human setting in which caregiving could continue. This helps explain why the title question should not be treated as only a matter of family feeling or household preference. It is also a matter of workload. The species that produced highly dependent children also produced adults whose daily lives required sustained effort across many tasks. That combination makes exclusive two-parent care look less like the original structure and more like a compressed version of something older. Human childhood appears to have rested not only on parental devotion, but on the wider distribution of labor that kept both children and caregivers going. The burden of raising a child becomes easier to understand when we stop imagining care as a separate activity and start seeing it as something woven into every other human demand. In the early history of our species, there was no clean border between childcare on one side and the rest of life on the other. The same hands that held a child also carried food, tended fire, prepared materials, cleared space, watched weather, and responded to danger. This meant that every child was living inside a constant negotiation of labor. Care had to continue, but so did everything else. That simple fact may tell us more about human childhood than any ideal picture of family. A child needed direct attention, of course, but direct attention alone was never enough. The whole surrounding world had to keep functioning for that attention to remain possible. This is where the beginning of human life again becomes central. In small bands, camps, and early settlements, survival depended on repeated work that could not be postponed for long. Fire went out if neglected. Food spoiled or remained inedible if not processed. Water still had to be carried. Shelter still had to be managed. Movement still had to be timed. Illness, injury, fatigue, weather, and uncertainty still pressed against the day. When a child is placed into this kind of environment, the question of who raises that child becomes inseparable from the question of how work is distributed. If only two adults are responsible, then both care and survival become fragile whenever one task interrupts another. If care can move through a wider circle, the entire system becomes more flexible. Flexibility may be one of the most important hidden features of human child-rearing. A child cries when a mother is occupied. Another adult notices. A father is away on a necessary task. Another person shares food or supervision. One child needs carrying while another wanders toward risk. An older sibling or nearby adult redirects them. A person who is not the parent repairs a tool, keeps a fire, or prepares a space, and in doing so makes it easier for the parents to continue caring. None of this looks dramatic, yet it may be exactly how human childhood remained workable across long stretches of time. The point is not that everyone performed the same role. Human groups were surely uneven, shaped by age, strength, status, kinship, illness, and circumstance. But unevenness does not erase shared burden. In fact, it can make shared burden even more important. Where tasks are many and lives are uncertain, it helps when responsibility can shift without the whole structure failing. That is one reason the isolated two-parent model seems historically narrow when placed against human origins. It asks us to imagine a form of child-rearing that leaves very little room for interruption, substitution, or overlap in a species whose entire early life depended on all three. This wider view also changes how we think about what it means to raise a child. Raising a child is not only feeding, holding, and protecting that child directly. It is also maintaining the surrounding human environment in which those acts can continue tomorrow, and the next day, and the next year. The person who keeps the fire going may be part of child-rearing. The person who shares food may be part of child-rearing. The person who frees a caregiver's hands for a short time may be part of child-rearing. The person whose presence reduces danger may be part of child-rearing. Once the real weight of labor is seen in this broader way, the title of the video begins to answer itself without becoming a blunt conclusion. Humans may never have been raised by just two parents, because the work of keeping a child alive was never separate from the work of keeping a human group alive, and that larger work has always extended beyond two people. No human mother begins from a position of unlimited strength. This is easy to forget in modern discussions of parenting, yet it may be one of the most important facts in the history of our species. Pregnancy is costly. Birth is costly. Recovery is costly. Feeding an infant, especially through breastfeeding, is costly in time, energy, sleep, and bodily reserves. These are not side details added onto motherhood after the child arrives. They are part of the biological foundation of human life. If we return to the beginning of our species, this foundation becomes even more important. A mother caring for a human infant was not doing so in a world where all other demands paused. She still lived inside a setting where food had to be found, water had to be carried, warmth had to be maintained, and danger had to be watched. This is one reason the question of whether humans were raised by just two parents becomes so difficult to answer in a narrow way. It is not only that children needed much, it is that mothers themselves, by the nature of human reproduction, were likely to need support too. Human infants are unusually dependent, and human mothers bear a large share of the earliest burden. A newborn may need frequent feeding, carrying, soothing, and close bodily contact. If the mother is the only reliable source of milk in the earliest stage, her availability becomes essential, but that same dependence can make it harder for her to perform every other necessary task. The child draws her time inward just as the world continues pressing outward. From an evolutionary perspective, this creates a structural problem. If a mother's body is heavily committed to one infant, then any wider support around her may become more than helpful. It may become part of the practical system that allows both mother and child to continue. This does not mean the past was gentle or easy. On the contrary, it may mean the burden on mothers was often intense. But intense burden is exactly why wider help becomes plausible. Someone else preparing food can matter. Someone else carrying materials can matter. Someone else holding the baby briefly, watching an older child, or reducing immediate risk can matter. Even small acts of relief become important when the bodily demands of reproduction are high. This is especially true when we remember that human reproduction often overlaps in time. A mother may still be caring for one dependent child while becoming pregnant again, or while managing the lingering physical effects of a previous birth. In a species with rapid independence, this overlap would matter less. In humans, where infancy is prolonged and childhood remains demanding, the overlap can become substantial. The question is no longer whether a mother loved the child, or whether a father was important. The question is what kind of surrounding arrangement could make continued care possible under these biological conditions. Returning again to the origin point of our species helps clarify the answer. Human life began not in isolated household units with abundant reserves, but in environments where daily survival required labor, movement, knowledge, and cooperation. In such conditions, the reproductive burden carried by mothers would have pressed strongly against the idea of child rearing as the work of one woman supported only by one man. Broader support from other women, older children, grandparents, kin, or nearby adults begins to look less like an optional cultural extra and more like a recurring advantage. The most careful conclusion is still modest. We cannot describe every ancient arrangement in detail, and we should not pretend to know the emotional texture of every prehistoric group, but the biology is clear enough to guide us. Human mothers faced real physical and energetic constraints. Human infants remained intensely dependent, and those two facts together make it difficult to imagine that the raising of children was usually sustained by only two adults acting alone. A mother caring for a young child is never dealing with only one demand at a time. This may be one of the deepest reasons human child rearing appears so difficult to contain within a pair. The mother is not simply a parent in the abstract. She is also a body recovering, producing milk, losing sleep, managing pain, regulating effort, and often continuing to live under conditions where daily survival still requires movement, labor, and judgment. When we place motherhood back into the longer history of our species, this becomes even more important. Human mothers did not raise infants in settings designed to reduce every other pressure. They raised them inside the same world that required food, warmth, water, vigilance, and response to uncertainty. The child's dependence therefore rested upon the mother's dependence too, not in the sense of weakness, but in the sense that her work became easier or harder depending on who else was around. A breastfeeding infant ties care closely to the mother, especially early on. Yet this closeness does not mean the mother can provide every form of support by herself. In fact, the closer the infant remains to her body, the more obvious the value of others may become. If she must sit to feed, someone else can prepare food. If she is exhausted, someone else can watch an older child. If she is recovering physically, someone else can carry water, tend fire, or manage a nearby task. The infant may depend most directly on the mother, but the mother's ability to continue that care can depend on a much wider human background. This is one of the quiet ways human childhood may have always extended beyond two parents, without denying the central bond between mother and child. The origin point of our species helps sharpen this further. Human evolution did not produce mothers caring for one infant in stillness, with all external obligations suspended. It produced mothers inside moving, working, socially demanding environments. The same mother who feeds a child may also need to relocate with the group, respond to weather, manage scarce resources, stay alert to risk, and continue the daily routines that keep everyone alive. Under these conditions, support is not a luxury. It becomes part of the structure that makes maternal care sustainable across time. This is especially important because the demands of motherhood are not confined to the first days after birth. Human infants remain dependent for a long time, and the physical and energetic costs of maternal care can continue long after delivery. Feeding may go on for many months or longer. Sleep may remain broken. Carrying may continue. Emotional and sensory attention remains constant. Meanwhile, life does not become simpler. It keeps producing other needs. Once this long duration is recognized, the two-parent model begins to look narrow not only because of the child's needs, but because of the mother's prolonged load. That load can be reduced by wider participation, even when no one fully replaces her role. This is a crucial distinction. Shared child-rearing does not require that everyone do the same thing. It requires only that the total burden be distributed enough to prevent collapse. A grandmother may not nurse the infant, yet she may protect the mother's time. An older child may not understand everything, yet may still distract a younger sibling. Another adult may not be a primary caregiver, yet may reduce danger, share food, or take over another task. Each small shift matters because maternal care is happening inside a crowded field of obligations. The most careful reading of human origins, therefore, does not suggest that mothers were unimportant or easily replaceable. It suggests something more grounded. Mothers were so important, and their work so costly, that broader support around them would often have been deeply useful. Human children may not have been raised by just two parents, in part because one of those parents was already carrying a burden so biologically demanding that the wider group became part of the child's true support system. The history of motherhood becomes even more revealing when we stop treating care as a single bond and start seeing it as a layered system. A mother may stand at the center of the earliest relationship, but no center can hold without surrounding structure. This is especially true in humans. A human infant demands repeated closeness, frequent feeding, bodily warmth, rapid response, and constant observation. At the same time, the mother remains a human being with limits set by fatigue, hunger, recovery, pain, and the continuing demands of ordinary life. This simple reality may be one of the strongest clues in the entire question of why humans were never raised by just two parents. The issue is not whether the mother mattered most in the beginning. She likely often did. The issue is whether the full burden surrounding that bond could realistically stay within only two adults over long periods of time. When we return to the earliest human settings, the answer appears increasingly doubtful. A mother recovering from birth may still need to move with the group, respond to changing weather, manage food, or remain attentive to the needs of older children. The infant may require long periods of contact, but those periods do not erase other obligations. Instead, they stack on top of them. This stacking effect is important. Human care is difficult not only because each need is large, but because many needs arrive at once. Feed the infant, and another child still needs watching. Rest the body, and fire still needs tending. Focus on the newborn, and food still must be prepared, recover from birth, and daily life still presses forward. In such a setting, any wider help around the mother becomes more than kindness. It becomes structure. This is one reason it may be misleading to imagine early child-rearing as a closed scene composed only of mother, father, and child. That image is emotionally powerful because it is intimate, but intimacy does not describe the full ecology of care. The mother may nurse the infant, yet another adult may free her hands by taking over another task. The mother may carry the child, yet someone else may carry tools, food, or water. The mother may be the one to answer the infant's earliest needs, yet a broader ring of people may be quietly making that answering possible. In this sense, the support around motherhood may not have been secondary to child-rearing. It may have been part of child-rearing itself. The beginning of our species seems to point in that direction. Human reproduction produces infants who are highly dependent and mothers who face prolonged bodily and energetic strain. Those facts alone do not tell us every detail of prehistoric life, but they do tell us where pressure would have existed. Pressure falls where needs exceed the easy capacity of one body or one pair. Human motherhood carries exactly that kind of pressure. The larger the pressure, the more useful, flexible support becomes. A grandmother, a sibling, another woman, another man, a nearby elder, even a child slightly older than the infant, may all matter in different ways, at different times, without replacing the mother's special role. This is what makes the old human pattern look wider than the modern image of two-parent care. The mother remains central, but centrality is surrounded by dependence on others. Once this is seen clearly, the title question gains another layer of meaning. Humans may not have been raised by just two parents because the earliest burden of life rested so heavily on the mother that wider support was often built into the very possibility of successful care. The child did not simply need a mother. The mother, in practical terms, needed a world around her that could keep both of them going. Fathers have likely mattered for a very long time in human life, but not always in the narrow form that modern culture often imagines. When people hear the phrase two-parent household, they often picture a balanced pair carrying nearly the whole burden of raising a child between them. That image is powerful because it feels orderly, yet the longer history of our species suggests that the father's role, while often important, was usually embedded inside a larger field of relationships, rather than sealed inside an isolated domestic unit. This distinction matters. To say that humans were not raised by just two parents is not to say that fathers did not matter. It is to say that fathers may have mattered within a wider social structure that also included mothers, older siblings, grandparents, kin, and other nearby adults. In the beginning of human life, this wider structure would have been difficult to avoid. Early human groups depended on cooperation for survival. Food, movement, protection, fire, tools, knowledge of place, and response to danger all required attention and labor. A father in such a world may have contributed food, protection, teaching, social position, or alliance, but he would have done so as part of a group already tied together by overlapping tasks. His presence was meaningful, yet not necessarily exclusive in the way modern family images sometimes imply. The child's world likely included him, but also extended beyond him. This is important because the role of a father can be broader than direct moment-to-moment care. In many human settings, fathers contribute through provisioning, protection, social support to the mother, play, modeling of adult behavior, discipline, connection to wider kin, and later teaching of practical skills. These forms of contribution can be central without meaning that the child is raised only by a mother and father acting alone. In fact, the very need for fathers to perform activities beyond direct childcare may have made wider shared care even more likely. A father away gathering food, monitoring danger, traveling, negotiating, or handling tools is still contributing to the child's survival, but his absence from the immediate scene of care leaves space that others may temporarily fill. The origin point of our species helps us see this more clearly. Human beings did not evolve in neatly private homes with all parental functions concentrated in one room. They evolved in socially dense environments where different forms of contribution could come from different people at different moments. A father may return with food. A grandmother may hold the child. A sibling may distract the child. Another adult may notice danger. The child's development is still shaped by the father, but not only by the father. Once we place fatherhood back inside this older human arrangement, the title of the video becomes easier to understand without turning into an attack on the father's role. The point is not that fathers were unimportant or absent. The point is that fatherhood itself may have evolved as one part of a cooperative system. A father's effort could matter greatly while still depending on others to help sustain the child's daily world. This also explains why the modern ideal of two parents doing nearly everything alone can feel both emotionally meaningful and practically exhausting. It takes one important human role, fatherhood, and asks it to function inside a narrowed support structure. From the deeper perspective of human origins, that narrowing may be historically unusual. The father is still real, still central, still consequential, but the child shaped by human evolution seems likely to have grown up among more than two significant adults, even when the father remained one of the most important among them. A father's importance in human life may be easiest to understand when we stop measuring it only by physical closeness. In the modern imagination, a good father is often pictured as someone who is constantly present in the home, sharing direct care in visible ways. That image reflects one historical arrangement, and it can be meaningful. But if we return to the deeper history of our species, the father's role may have been important in a more distributed sense. He may have mattered not only through holding, feeding, or watching the child directly, but also through the many forms of labor and connection that made direct care possible for others. This distinction is essential. A child may be deeply shaped by a father even when the father is not the only adult nearby, and even when the child's daily care passes through several hands. In early human environments, this wider pattern would have made practical sense. A father may have contributed food, defended access to resources, supported the mother, shared knowledge of place, modeled useful behavior, or helped anchor the child within a wider kin network. These are not small contributions. They can affect survival, development, and belonging, but they do not automatically produce a closed two-parent world. On the contrary, the more varied the father's role becomes, the more likely it is that other adults are also involved. A father moving through the landscape to secure food or respond to risk may be helping the child precisely by not remaining fixed at the child's side every moment. That means others near the child matter too. The child's world opens outward, not because the father is weak, but because the father's contribution is part of a larger system of cooperation. This becomes clearer when we return again to human origins. The beginning of our species did not take place in settings where one mother and one father could easily isolate themselves and meet every need within a self-contained unit. Human life emerged in groups whose survival depended on overlapping effort. If the father's work partly unfolded beyond the immediate space of the child, then the child's daily life had to remain viable in his temporary absence. Someone had to notice cries, carry the infant, share food, redirect danger, or absorb part of the mother's load. In such a setting, the father remains meaningful, but he remains meaningful inside a field of other meaningful people. This helps correct two opposite mistakes at once. One mistake is to imagine that fathers did not matter in the human past. The other is to imagine that fatherhood by itself completed the full structure of child rearing. The deeper human pattern may have rested somewhere between these extremes. Fathers likely mattered a great deal, yet their importance was woven into a network that made room for others. A child may have known the father as protector, provider, model, or central adult voice, while still growing through contact with siblings, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and unrelated adults in the same group. Once this is understood, the title question becomes less confrontational and more precise. Humans may not have been raised by just two parents, not because fatherhood was missing, but because fatherhood itself functioned inside a broader human arrangement. The father did not stand outside the network. He was one of its strongest strands. And like any strand in a woven structure, his strength may have depended partly on the presence of the others around him. The child, in turn, was not formed by one relationship alone, but by the steady overlap of many, among which the father could remain central without ever being sufficient by himself. The father becomes most visible in the human story when we stop asking whether he was present or absent, and begin asking how his role fit into the larger architecture of care. That architecture was likely never simple. A father may have been deeply important to a child's survival and development, yet still not have formed a self-sufficient unit with the mother. This is the key distinction. Human beings do not seem to have evolved around the image of two adults carrying every form of care in isolation. They seem to have evolved in social settings where different kinds of support came from different people, and where the father's contribution, though often meaningful, was only one part of a broader pattern. In the long beginning of our species, this broader pattern would have been shaped by ordinary reality. A father might help secure food, respond to threats, support the mother, teach practical skills, guide older children, and contribute to the standing of the family within a wider group. Those forms of involvement matter greatly. They may affect whether children are fed, protected, accepted, and later prepared for adult life. But precisely because those tasks are varied, fatherhood cannot be reduced to the modern image of one man sharing every hour of direct care equally inside a closed home. His value may have been partly outside the child's immediate reach at any given moment, and that would naturally leave room for others to become important inside the child's daily world. This is where the question of human origins matters again. Early human groups were not made of isolated households standing neatly apart from one another. They were made of overlapping relations, shared work, shifting cooperation, and repeated dependence on multiple people. In such a setting, a father's effort could matter while the child still spent much of daily life in the presence of others. One person may guide a child away from danger. Another may share food. Another may hold the infant briefly while the mother rests or works. Another may model speech, gesture, or the handling of familiar objects. None of these people erase the father's role. Instead, they show how fatherhood likely operated inside a field of support rather than in place of it. This helps explain why it is misleading to treat the title of this video as a rejection of fathers. The deeper idea is almost the opposite. Fathers may have mattered enough that their contributions became more effective when the surrounding group helped hold the rest of the structure together. A father who contributes food can do so more reliably if others help protect the child nearby. A father who teaches an older child can do so more fully if someone else is carrying an infant. A father who supports the mother may be doing so inside a network that also supports her. In this sense, fatherhood may be strongest not when isolated, but when woven into a cooperative environment. This is also one reason the modern narrowing of family life can feel so demanding. It asks the father to remain central, while also expecting a very small household to absorb tasks that may once have been spread across several adults and several generations. The strain is not proof that fathers matter less. It may be evidence that the whole old structure around fatherhood has become smaller. The most careful conclusion, then, is not that fathers were absent from the deep human past, nor that they formed one half of a neatly sufficient pair. It is that fathers likely mattered in ways shaped by the wider human group. The child may have depended on the father, yet also on the people who made the father's contribution workable within the flow of everyday life. Seen this way, the human child was never formed by one relationship alone. Even when fatherhood was central, childhood itself still appears larger than two people. Some of the most important figures in human childhood may have stood just outside the modern image of parenthood. Not outside the child's life, but outside the narrow frame through which many people now imagine family. A grandmother, an older sibling, an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, or another familiar adult in the group may not fit the image of a two-parent household, yet such people could have carried an enormous share of the real work that childhood required. This matters because the title of the video is not only about mothers and fathers, it is about the larger human structure around a child, and that structure may have depended heavily on people whose roles modern life sometimes treats as secondary. In the deeper history of our species, they may not have been secondary at all. Human childhood is too long, too demanding, and too full of repeated need to rest easily on only two adults. Once that is understood, the wider circle comes into focus. Grandmothers are often discussed in anthropology because older women may have contributed food, knowledge, protection, and support to both mothers and children in ways that improve survival. We should stay careful and not turn this into a universal formula, but the broad idea is plausible and powerful. A grandmother who no longer carries the full bodily burden of raising her own infants may still hold valuable experience, practical memory, and usable energy. She may know food sources, seasons, routes, hazards, and the rhythms of care. She may free the mother's time, calm a child, watch siblings, or steady the camp in subtle ways that do not look dramatic yet matter greatly. older siblings may matter just as much in a different form. In many human settings, slightly older children are not passive figures waiting for adulthood. They are already part of the moving structure of daily life. They carry, watch, distract, imitate, learn, and sometimes help hold the attention of the younger ones. An older sibling does not replace a parent, but may still become part of the child's practical world in repeated, meaningful ways. The younger child grows not only through instruction from adults, but through constant proximity to those who are only a few steps ahead in development. This layered structure may be one of the quiet signatures of human life. When we return to the beginning of our species, it becomes easier to see why. Small groups living through work, movement, and shared space would naturally place children among several generations at once. A child's world would not be sorted neatly by age into separate institutions. The old, the young, the very young, and the adult would often remain within the same field of visibility and sound. That arrangement creates repeated chances for care to be distributed. One person holds an infant. Another answers a question. Another warns against danger. Another demonstrates emotion. Another keeps a parent free long enough to finish a necessary task. Over months and years, these small contributions become part of the actual architecture of childhood. This wider structure also helps explain why the modern narrowing of family can feel historically unusual. When grandparents live far away, when siblings are fewer, when households are more isolated, and when daily life is separated into private units, many of these older forms of support shrink or disappear. Yet the child remains a child of the same species, still long dependent, still socially hungry, still slow to mature. From that deeper perspective, grandmothers and siblings do not look like optional extras surrounding an already complete two-parent system. They begin to look like some of the hidden supports that may have long helped make human childhood possible. The wider circle around a child becomes easier to see when we stop looking only for official caregivers and start noticing repeated usefulness. Human childhood is full of repeated need, and repeated need draws in anyone who is near enough, old enough, or steady enough to matter. A grandmother may not be the child's mother, yet she may help hold together the daily conditions that allow the mother to continue. An older sibling may not be an adult, yet may still watch, distract, guide, imitate, and warn in ways that shape the younger child's world. These roles are easy to undervalue in modern imagination because they often appear informal, but informality does not make them small. In the longer history of our species, informal support may have been one of the most stable realities of childhood. The reason is simple. Human life was rarely organized around one child, one room, and two uninterrupted adults. It was organized around groups facing many overlapping tasks. In that environment, care naturally spread through proximity and repetition. A grandmother sitting nearby while food is prepared may become part of childcare without any announcement. A slightly older child walking alongside a younger one may become part of childcare without any formal role. Across days, seasons, and years, these repeated small acts can matter enormously. This is especially important when we return to the beginnings of human life. Early human groups likely lived in conditions where generations remained more visibly entangled than they often are in modern urban life. The very young, the growing, the fully adult, and the old would often share space, sound, movement, and routine. That arrangement changes development. A child in such a setting is not receiving input from only two adults. The child is living inside a layered human world. One person may represent patience. Another may represent caution. One may carry knowledge of food. Another may carry memory of place. One older sibling may model boldness. Another may model restraint. Over time, the child becomes shaped by many repeated presences, not just by a single parental pair. Grandmothers become especially interesting in this picture because they may unite care and memory. An older woman may remember roots, seasons, hazards, foods, and bodily rhythms of care that younger adults have not yet learned fully. She may also be more available for certain tasks than a mother managing a nursing infant or a father occupied elsewhere. This does not mean all grandmothers played the same role in every human setting. It means only that older generations may have offered real practical value in a species with long childhood and overlapping reproductive demands. Older siblings matter for a different reason. They stand between dependence and competence. Because of that position, they may become constant companions to younger children and frequent helpers to adults. A younger child may learn what is safe, what is forbidden, what is interesting, and what is possible partly through the behavior of an older sibling. These influences are not minor. Human beings learn heavily through observation and repetition, and older children provide both. This layered structure helps explain why the title of the video should not be heard only as a statement about parents. It is also a statement about generations. Human children may never have been raised by just two parents because the work of childhood was quietly distributed through a multi-generational field. The child did not belong only to the labor of mother and father, but also to the repeated presence of those standing just beyond them. Once seen this way, the broader human pattern becomes clearer. The child grows through a surrounding structure of kin and near kin, where the older and the slightly older both help bridge the distance between helpless infancy and adult life. What grandmothers, older siblings, and other nearby kin reveal most clearly is that human childhood may have been supported by layers rather than by a single line of care. This layered pattern matters because a child's needs do not arrive all in one form. Some needs are immediate and physical. Others are gradual and social. Some require strength. Others require patience, memory, or simple presence. It would be difficult for only two adults to meet all of these needs continuously across many years, especially under the conditions in which our species first lived. But once a wider set of familiar people enters the picture, the structure begins to make more sense. One person may help with carrying, another may help with watching, another may help with food, with comfort, with example, or with the quiet transfer of useful habits. The child's life becomes held up by many kinds of repeated contribution. This is where the older human world becomes especially important. In small groups, camps, and early settlements, people of different ages were likely more entangled in daily life than they often are now. There were fewer sharp divisions between the sphere of children and the sphere of adults, fewer institutional separations, fewer private compartments. A child could remain within view of several generations at once. That meant the child was not only protected by a wider field of attention, the child was also being formed by a wider field of behavior. A grandmother may offer steadiness, memory, and practiced care. A grandfather may contribute protection, knowledge, and social weight. An older sibling may pull the younger one into motion, imitation, and play, while at the same time helping keep that child within the orbit of the group. Even someone not directly responsible at any one moment may still shape the child by being consistently near. These repeated presences matter, because human development is unusually responsive to social surroundings. A child learns not only from planned instruction but from who is nearby, who reacts, who repeats, who corrects, who demonstrates, and who remains calm when something unfamiliar appears. In that sense, the broader circle around the child is not just background. It becomes part of the mechanism of growth itself. The child learns what kinds of people exist, how voices differ, how bodies move with age, how authority sounds, how comfort sounds, how work looks in different hands. A household reduced to two adults can still provide love and care, but it cannot easily reproduce the full social texture of this older arrangement. This is why the title of the video should not be understood too narrowly. The deeper point is not simply that parents had help. It is that human childhood may have been built inside a multi-layered human environment from the start. Grandmothers and older siblings are especially revealing because they show how care can be real without looking official. They may not be named as the primary caretakers, yet their repeated usefulness changes the actual shape of the child's life. A grandmother may give the mother time to recover or work. An older sibling may keep a toddler close enough to avoid danger. Another relative may share food, space, or knowledge. None of these acts alone defines a complete system, but together they form something larger than two-parent care. They form a human childhood supported by generations standing close enough to matter. This does not mean every child in the past received abundant help, or that every kin group functioned smoothly. Human life has always included loss, tension, and uneven burdens. But even with that caution, the broader pattern remains persuasive. A child of our species seems to fit naturally into a layered world, where the path from infancy to adulthood is quietly held up by more people than a mother and father alone. One of the strongest ways to think carefully about the human past is to look, with great caution, at human societies that have lived in smaller-scale settings closer in some respects to older patterns of life. Anthropologists have often done this not because such societies are exact copies of prehistory, but because they can still reveal possibilities that industrial life tends to hide. This caution matters. No living community is a fossil. No present-day group can be treated as a direct window into the distant human past. Every society has its own history, pressures, and changes. Even so, cross-cultural observation has repeatedly pointed toward one broad pattern that matters deeply for the question in this video. In many small-scale societies, the care of children is not confined neatly to one mother and one father acting alone. It is often spread, in different degrees, across siblings, grandparents, kin, neighbours, and other familiar adults. This does not prove that every early human group looked the same. It does suggest that wider circles of care are not unusual distortions of human life. They may be among its recurring forms. What anthropologists often notice is not a single rule, but a shared tendency. Children move through social space surrounded by more than two important adults. Infants may be held by several people across a day. Mothers may remain central, especially early on, yet others often step in with carrying, watching, comforting, playing, or feeding when possible. Slightly older children may spend long periods near siblings or other relatives. Advice, discipline, imitation, and daily guidance may come from many directions. The point is not that all responsibility disappears into the group. The point is that childhood often unfolds inside a network rather than inside a sealed pair bond. This becomes especially interesting when we place it against the beginning of our species. Human children are born highly dependent, remain immature for a very long time, and require constant social as well as physical input. If anthropologists repeatedly observe that wider caregiving networks are workable and common in a range of human societies, then that pattern sits comfortably beside the broader biological and historical logic we have already been following. A species with long childhood and heavy caregiving demands would have reason to rely on many nearby hands, voices, and eyes. Modern industrial life often hides this because so much childcare has been compressed into private interiors or outsourced to institutions. But in smaller-scale communities, the wider human setting around a child can still be seen more directly. A child is not always managed by schedule alone. The child is often absorbed into the ordinary presence of others. This is another reason anthropological evidence is so useful here. It does not give us certainty about prehistory, but it gives us living examples of how human child-rearing can function outside the isolated two-parent model. It shows that broader care is not only imaginable, it is practical, durable, and recognizably human. We should still remain restrained. Anthropologists do not all describe the same pattern everywhere. Levels of paternal involvement vary. Roles of grandparents vary. The strength of kinship ties varies. Some communities are more cooperative than others. Some are more hierarchical. Some place heavier burdens on mothers than others. Yet variation itself strengthens the main point rather than weakening it. Human beings are capable of organizing care in many forms, and across that variation, wider involvement beyond two parents appears again and again. That recurring presence matters. It suggests that the narrow household often treated today as natural may be only one arrangement among many, and perhaps not the deepest one in the story of our species. If the human child is biologically slow, socially hungry, and expensive to raise, then it makes sense that anthropologists so often find children growing within a larger ring of care, rather than under the exclusive management of only two adults. Anthropological evidence becomes most useful when it is read for pattern rather than for perfect resemblance. No living community can tell us exactly how prehistoric humans lived, and careful scholars do not claim that it can. But when many studies across different regions repeatedly show that children are handled, watched, corrected, comforted, and taught by more people than only their mother and father, that repetition deserves attention. It does not solve the whole historical question, but it helps narrow what seems plausible. Human child-rearing, across many observed societies, often appears more distributed than the modern isolated household would lead us to expect. This matters because anthropology gives us something archaeology rarely can: direct observation of how social life actually moves around children. In many smaller-scale communities, Care is not always concentrated into one private domestic unit. It may flow through the day as children move among familiar people. A mother may remain central, yet a grandmother may hold the infant. A sibling may guide a toddler. An aunt may discipline. A neighbor may feed. And older children may spend long stretches in one another's company. These patterns differ in detail from place to place, but the deeper structure is recognizable. The child is not formed only by a pair. The child is formed inside a network of repeated contact. This becomes even more important when we return to the origins of our species. Human young are not only physically dependent, they are also deeply social learners. They absorb language, gesture, rhythm, emotional tone, rules of attention, and practical behavior through sustained exposure to many interactions. If anthropology repeatedly shows that children can grow within a wider social field, then this fits closely with the developmental logic of human biology. A long childhood placed inside many relationships may not be a departure from human nature. It may be one of its most familiar expressions. Another important insight from anthropology is that support does not need to be equal to be real. In modern discussions, people often assume that unless another person shares parenting in a perfectly balanced way, that person does not count as part of child rearing. But observed human life is rarely organized so neatly. One person may only help occasionally, yet those moments may still matter greatly. Another may contribute food rather than direct care. Another may offer protection, teaching, or social acceptance. A child's world can be widened by uneven contributions that still accumulate over time. This is important because it helps us avoid a false choice between total parental responsibility and complete communal raising. The human pattern may often lie somewhere in between. The mother and father may remain especially important, but the child's actual growth may still depend on many others whose support is partial, shifting, and real. This wider view also helps explain why so many parents in modern isolated settings describe raising children as overwhelming. Anthropology cannot tell any one family what it should do, and it should not be turned into a moral lesson. But it can help us see that the exhaustion of narrow child rearing may not be a sign of personal failure. It may reflect the fact that a species shaped over very long stretches of time in wider social surroundings is now often trying to raise children inside smaller, thinner units. That possibility becomes easier to take seriously when anthropologists keep finding, across different societies, that human children are rarely surrounded by only two meaningful adults. The exact form changes, but the broader pattern remains. Childhood appears again and again as something supported by layers of relationship, not contained fully within a pair. The anthropological record does not give us certainty about prehistory, but it does give us a strong reminder that the two-parent household is not the only recognizable human arrangement, and perhaps not the one that most closely echoes the deeper social background from which human childhood emerged. What anthropology offers, at its best, is not a perfect map of the past, but a disciplined way of limiting fantasy. It reminds us that human beings have lived in many forms, and that the modern isolated household should not be mistaken too quickly for the timeless shape of childhood. When anthropologists study small-scale societies, what often becomes visible is not a single universal rule but a repeated human possibility. Children grow up amid many familiar presences. They are carried by one person, corrected by another, watched by another, fed by another, and slowly drawn into group life through a web of overlapping relationships. This does not mean every child receives equal care from everyone nearby. It means only that the child's actual developmental environment is usually wider than a pair. That repeated observation matters because it sits so closely beside everything else we know about human childhood. Human young are slow to mature, physically dependent, socially open, and demanding for years. A species shaped that way would be expected to rely, at least often, on a wider circle of support. Anthropology does not prove the whole case by itself, but it strengthens the direction of the argument. It shows that broader child rearing is not an odd exception found only in rare places. It is one of the recurring forms human life can take when it is not compressed into highly privatized modern structures. This point becomes especially useful when we return once more to the beginning of our species. Early humans likely lived in ways that made proximity unavoidable, shared labor necessary, and overlapping responsibilities normal. In such conditions, It would be surprising if childcare remained sealed inside only 2 adults. Anthropological comparison helps us see that surprise more clearly. Many observed societies show that human children can be surrounded by kin, older children, grandparents, and other adults without losing the special importance of mother and father. The wider circle does not erase the center. It gives the center support, context, and continuity. This may be one of the most important insights in the whole video. The opposite of two-parent isolation is not the disappearance of parents. It is the presence of a larger human field in which parents remain central but not alone. That distinction helps protect the argument from becoming too blunt. We do not need to claim that all humans were raised communally in the same way, or that every society distributed care equally, or that ancient life was socially generous. None of that can be known so simply. What we can say more carefully is that across observed human variation, the two-parent household does not appear to be the only normal form, and often not the broadest one. Children repeatedly seem to do their growing amid many relationships, many handovers, and many forms of partial care. Anthropology also teaches another quiet lesson. What supports childhood is not always visible as a formal role. A person can shape a child's life without being named as a primary caregiver. A grandmother may protect a mother's time. A sibling may keep a younger child near safety. A familiar adult may provide food, warning, emotional tone, or repeated example. Once these smaller contributions are taken seriously, the structure around the child looks much larger than modern household language often allows. That is why this evidence matters so much. It does not answer every question, but it tells us what kind of answer is more likely to be true. Human childhood, viewed through anthropology as well as biology and history, appears less like the product of one closed pair and more like the work of a wider ring of human nearness. If that is so, then the title of the video may name not a dramatic theory, but a quiet pattern hidden in plain sight. The human child seems to come from a species whose earliest form of growing up was larger than 2 parents alone. Archaeology rarely gives us a direct picture of family life in the modern sense. It can show where people lived, what they made, what they ate, how they buried the dead, how space was organized, how tools changed, and sometimes how groups moved or stayed in place. But it almost never gives a simple scene in which we can point to one mother, one father, one child, and say with confidence that this was the full unit of care. This silence is important. Many modern people assume that if the 2-parent household feels natural, the ancient record must surely confirm it. In fact, the material record is much quieter and much less obedient to modern expectation. What archaeology often reveals is not a small sealed family, but shared space, repeated activity, clustered occupation, and the traces of collective life. This matters because the absence of a clear nuclear family picture in deep time should make us cautious. It does not prove that such family units never existed in any form, but it does mean that archaeology does not strongly support the idea that human childhood was originally designed around a closed household of 2 parents alone. When we return to the origins of our species, this caution becomes even more necessary. Early human groups left behind hearths, stone tools, cut-marked bones, pigments, shelters, campsites, middens, footprints, burials, and activity areas. These traces can tell us that people gathered, worked, rested, processed food, made objects, and shared certain spaces over time. They can sometimes suggest the presence of multiple generations or repeated habitation by groups rather than isolated individuals. But those traces do not easily break down into the private household categories familiar today. A hearth may be shared. A camp may be occupied by several related or unrelated adults. A burial may tell us that someone was cared for in illness or remembered after death, but not that child-rearing rested only on 2 biological parents. In this sense, archaeology does not hand us the modern family projected backward. It more often shows us human life in clusters. That alone should slow down any confident claim that children in deep history were raised mainly inside a narrow domestic pair. Another important point is that children themselves appear in archaeology in ways that remind us how dependent they were on the wider group. Burial evidence, settlement structure, wear patterns on spaces, and the location of activity areas can all suggest that the young were not kept apart from ordinary life. Children seem to have been present within the same broad settings where food was processed, tools were made, fires were kept, and social life unfolded. Again, we must stay careful. The material record is incomplete, and interpretation always has limits. But the broader impression is not one of strict domestic enclosure, it is one of overlap. This fits with the larger logic already building through the video. Human children were biologically slow to mature, social from the beginning, and costly to raise. Archaeology cannot prove exactly who held them, watched them, or calmed them at every stage, yet it repeatedly places them within worlds of shared material life, rather than within clearly isolated parental units. Even later, as settlements became more permanent in some places, archaeology often reveals compounds, clustered dwellings, shared work zones, storage, and communal features that still complicate the image of childhood being contained entirely within one pair-bonded household. The deeper lesson is not that archaeology solves the whole question. It is that archaeology refuses a simplistic answer. It does not give us strong grounds to say that the ancient human norm was one child, two parents, and a sealed domestic boundary around them. Instead, it shows a species living in shared arrangements, surrounded by common tasks, and rooted in social environments larger than the modern idea of the nuclear household. That silence around the two-parent model is meaningful. It does not speak loudly, but it leans in one direction. If human childhood had truly been shaped from the beginning inside a narrow household of two alone, the material past might look more like that. Instead, what we usually find are the remains of people living, working, and enduring together. The deeper value of archaeology in this question lies in what it makes difficult to claim. It makes it difficult to speak too confidently about a private two-parent household, as though it were the original and obvious container of human childhood. Material evidence from the long human past is usually broader than that. It shows places of repeated occupation, shared hearths, tool-making areas, food processing zones, burial grounds, movement across landscape, and sometimes structures that suggest clustered living rather than strict domestic isolation. These traces do not tell us everything, but they do tell us what kind of world children were likely growing up inside. It appears to have been a world of overlap. The young were not forming in a neatly sealed emotional chamber. They were forming inside the same material spaces where other people worked, slept, watched, ate, repaired, spoke, and remembered. This matters because archaeology is strongest when it reconstructs environments rather than intimate labels. We may not know exactly who counted as a parent in every case, or how affection was distributed, or which adult soothed a child on a given night. But we can often see whether people lived in ways that encourage separation or in ways that encourage shared presence. Again and again, the record leans toward shared presence. A campsite organized around a common hearth or a settlement with clustered activity does not prove cooperative child-rearing on its own, but it does create a setting where children would have remained near several people, several tasks, and several repeated forms of attention. This fits closely with the longer biological story of our species. A child who is slow to mature and costly to raise would not only need food and warmth, that child would need to remain embedded in a stable enough human environment to learn gradually from what happened around them. Archaeology often places children inside exactly that kind of environment. In some cases, even the way children's remains appear can be suggestive, not because they reveal every detail, but because they remind us that children were part of the group's material world from the beginning. They were buried, carried, mourned, and spatially included within the same broad settings as others. The evidence does not isolate them into a separate private zone. It keeps returning them to the wider group. This is important because modern imagination often works in the opposite direction. We begin with the isolated home and project it backward. Archaeology resists that projection. It presents us with lives arranged around practical interdependence. Fire was shared. Food work was shared, or at least spatially connected. Shelter often involved proximity. Useful knowledge was embedded in repeated action. Under those conditions, childhood itself was likely hard to isolate. Even if a mother and father were central figures, the child's lived experience would still have unfolded amid a larger field of bodies, voices, and material routines. Another reason archaeology matters here is that it keeps reminding us how much of human survival depended on persistence across generations. Sites are not only records of one moment, they are often records of repeated return, repeated use, repeated occupation, repeated care for place. That long continuity suggests that human groups were maintaining not only themselves, but the conditions in which the young could become future adults. A child in such a setting is not simply attached to two caregivers. The child is entering a durable human pattern of collective maintenance. We should still remain modest. Archaeology cannot settle the question alone. It does not let us describe each household, each kin pattern, or each form of care with certainty. But it does narrow the story. It gives us little reason to imagine deep human childhood as a private unit built around just two adults, and many reasons to imagine it unfolding in shared spaces where more people were close enough to matter. The silence of archaeology is therefore not empty. It gently pushes us away from the modern nuclear image and back toward a species that seems to have lived and therefore raised its young. In larger human arrangements, archaeology reaches its limit precisely where modern imagination often becomes most confident. People want the distant past to confirm familiar categories: mother, father, child, home. But the material record does not speak in those clean terms. It speaks in traces of occupation, fire use, repeated activity, movement, shared tools, clustered dwellings, food remains, burials, and the organization of space. From those traces we can begin to understand the environments in which children lived, though we cannot turn them into simple portraits of the nuclear family. This matters because the absence of clear proof for the modern two-parent household in deep time is not a small problem. It is a warning against projecting present arrangements backward as though they were always there. The deeper record of human life does not look like a line of sealed homes. It looks more like a pattern of people enduring together in overlapping material worlds. That overlapping world is exactly what makes the title of this video more plausible. Human children seem to have grown within settings where many people remain near enough to influence survival and learning, even if archaeology cannot name each role with certainty. The beginning of our species is especially important here. Early humans lived in ways that tied them closely to shared spaces and repeated cooperation. Camps were organized around practical necessities. Hearths drew bodies together. Tasks were spatially linked. Food processing, tool work, rest and care likely happened within sight or sound of one another more often than modern life would lead us to expect. A child in such a world would not only receive direct care from one or two adults, that child would also be shaped by the repeated background presence of the group. Archaeology can rarely show the moment of holding, teaching, soothing, or warning, yet it can show the setting in which those moments most likely occurred. And again that setting appears broader than a private domestic pair. This also helps explain why the archaeological record fits so well with the biological and anthropological arguments already behind us. Human young are unusually slow, dependent, and socially open. Anthropology often shows broader networks of care. Archaeology, while quieter, places children inside shared human environments where such networks would at least be easier to sustain than strict two-parent isolation. None of these lines of evidence alone settles the question, but together they lean in the same direction. The child of our species appears to belong not only to parents, but to a wider social and material world. Another important point is that archaeology often preserves evidence of continuity rather than isolation. Groups return to places, spaces are used again, hearths are renewed, tools are maintained, burials mark remembered lives. All of this suggests that human existence was structured around ongoing shared occupation and intergenerational persistence. Childhood would have unfolded inside that persistence. A child was not just a private dependent of two adults. A child was also part of a group's continuity through time. This is a subtle but important shift. It means that child-rearing may have been connected not only to affection and kinship, but also to the maintenance of a collective human future. Once childhood is seen that way, the idea of raising children through a wider circle of care becomes easier to understand. It no longer looks like an optional extension of the family. It begins to look like part of the larger structure through which human groups reproduced themselves across generations. The most careful conclusion remains restrained, but it is stronger now than when the question first began. Archaeology cannot give us a direct scene of cooperative child rearing. What it can do is remove confidence from the simpler picture. It shows us a species living in shared settings, organized around common material realities, and raising the young within those realities. The child in the archaeological past is rarely visible as the center of a private household. The child is visible, instead, as part of a wider human arrangement. That may be the quietest and most durable clue of all. The small household that feels normal to many people today did not appear all at once. It emerged gradually, through long historical changes that altered where people lived, how they worked, how property was held, how inheritance moved, and how daily life was divided between what counted as family and what counted as the outside world. This matters because the title of the video is not claiming that humans never lived with parents. Of course they did. The deeper point is that the tight, self-contained unit of two adults carrying most of childhood inside a private household appears to be a relatively recent narrowing when placed beside the much longer history of our species. For most of that history, people lived in ways that kept labor, kinship, and survival more visibly entangled. But over time, in many parts of the world, that wider entanglement began to change. As some human groups settled more permanently, accumulated more goods, managed land more closely, and organized inheritance more formally, the household itself began to matter in a new way. A dwelling was no longer only a place of shelter or repeated occupation. It could become a unit of property, production, descent, and control. Once that happened, the social meaning of family could begin to shrink inward. This does not mean that communal life disappeared or that wider kin stopped mattering. It means the walls around everyday life could begin to carry more weight than before. The child in such a world was still biologically the same kind of child, slow to mature, dependent for years, and shaped by many social inputs. But the structure surrounding that child was starting to change. Instead of being embedded mainly in a broad field of shared labor and overlapping generations, the child could increasingly be placed inside a household whose boundaries had become more defined. The beginning of our species still matters here, because this historical change did not create a new kind of child. It only changed the container around the child. Human beings had already evolved with long childhood, high dependence, and wide social learning. Those features remained. What changed, slowly and unevenly, was the way societies arranged responsibility, space, and obligation. In some settings, kin networks remained dense and active even within settled life. In others, the household became more sharply recognized as a unit with its own labor, its own property, and its own internal duties. That shift would have consequences for childhood. The more responsibility became attached to a bounded household, the easier it became to imagine that the people inside it were the natural and sufficient raisers of the child. What had once been distributed through a wider human setting could gradually be reinterpreted as the private burden of parents. This process was never simple or universal. Different regions, different economies, and different family systems produced different outcomes. Some communities kept large extended households. Others divided generations more sharply. Some relied heavily on nearby kin. Others placed more weight on conjugal pairs. We should be careful not to flatten this diversity into a single story. Yet the broad historical movement still matters. Across long stretches of settled and increasingly stratified life, the household could become narrower in social meaning, even while childhood remained long and demanding in biological fact. This is one reason the modern two-parent ideal can feel both natural and strangely heavy. It feels natural because many centuries of social organization have trained people to see the household as the proper center of care, but it feels heavy because the child inside that household still carries the older human design. The child still seems built for more voices, more hands, more layers of presence, and more flexible support than a narrow domestic unit can easily provide on its own. The two-parent household, then, may not be the beginning of the story. It may be one of the later historical forms into which a much older kind of human childhood was compressed. As households became more clearly bounded in history, the meaning of care began to shift with them. A child could still be loved by many people, visited by kin, surrounded by neighbors, and shaped by a wider community. Yet the formal expectation of who was responsible could gradually narrow. This narrowing matters because expectations can reshape experience, even when biology remains the same. The human child did not become easier to raise simply because society began to imagine the household as a more self-contained unit. Human infants still arrived dependent. Human children still matured slowly. Human learning still depended on long exposure to voices, gestures, routines, and correction. What changed was the social container in which those needs were increasingly supposed to be met. In many historical settings, especially where property, inheritance, and labor organization became more structured, the household grew more visible as a unit of obligation. It became easier to say, "These are the people responsible for this child." That sentence sounds ordinary now, but in the longer story of our species, it represents a major reorganization of care. Once land, goods, names, and legal status begin to move through more formal family lines, the household is no longer just a place where people happen to live together. It becomes a unit that can be counted, controlled, taxed, inherited, defended, and morally judged. Childhood changes under that pressure. The child is drawn more tightly into the internal life of the house, and the adults inside the house are asked to carry more of the visible burden. Yet the beginning of our species still shadows this transformation. The child inside the newer household is still the child of an older evolutionary design. That child still needs prolonged attention, repeated teaching, and a rich social environment in order to become fully competent. The historical household may become narrower, but the developmental needs inside it do not shrink to match. This is where tension begins to build. A bounded household can organize care more clearly, but it can also isolate care more heavily. Tasks once softened by overlap with kin or community may now appear as the private duty of a smaller number of adults. The emotional meaning of parenthood may grow stronger under this arrangement, but so may the weight of responsibility. What was once distributed across a wider social field can gradually harden into an expectation directed inward. This historical pressure did not unfold in the same way everywhere. Many societies preserved large households, compound living, strong kin ties, or close neighbouring support even while becoming more settled and structured. Others moved further towards smaller domestic units. Even within the same society, the balance could shift by class, region, livelihood, and period. We should not force history into a single line, but the general direction remains useful. The idea that a child properly belongs to one household, and that this household should bear the primary burden of raising that child, became more legible over time as social life itself became more compartmentalized. This helps explain something important about the title of the video. To say that humans were never raised by just two parents is not to deny that many societies increasingly organize responsibility that way. It is to suggest that this organization came later than the child it was trying to contain. The child came first in evolutionary time, and the child was shaped in wider settings of dependence and shared presence. The narrowed household came later as a historical arrangement layered over that older human pattern. Once this becomes clear, the modern sense of strain begins to make more sense too. The household may look complete from the outside, yet still feel too small from within because it is trying to hold a form of childhood that was not originally shaped inside such a tight boundary. History did not create the needs of the child. It created a smaller room around them. The final step in this historical narrowing may be the most familiar to modern eyes, the quiet belief that a household becomes more complete as it becomes more self-contained. Once that belief takes hold, two adults and their children can begin to look like the natural minimum of human life, rather than one historical arrangement among many. But when placed against the deeper background of our species, this idea remains surprisingly recent. Human beings did not begin in highly privatized domestic worlds. We began in settings where survival, labor, memory, and care moved across broader social space. The more history carved daily life into smaller units of responsibility, the more childhood itself was pulled inward with it. That process did not erase the wider human need around the child. It only made that need less visible. This is why the historical story matters so much. It helps explain how something relatively recent can come to feel ancient. Over generations, habits become expectations, and expectations become common sense. A child sleeping, eating, learning, and growing within one bounded household starts to seem like the obvious human pattern. The wider kin network, once woven tightly into everyday life, can begin to appear optional, secondary, or even intrusive. Yet the child inside this arrangement remains a child of the same species that evolved under much older conditions. The long dependency, the need for repeated attention, the gradual acquisition of language, judgment, emotional control, and practical competence. None of this disappeared when households became more sharply defined. The biological and developmental structure stayed largely the same, only the social container grew smaller. This produces one of the quietest tensions in modern family life. The household may be socially recognized as complete, yet developmentally it may still be leaning on absences. Those absences do not always show themselves as visible crisis. Sometimes they appear as exhaustion, overload, loneliness, or the constant feeling that there should be more hands, more time, more nearby people than the household actually contains. The beginning of our species helps us interpret that feeling without turning it into nostalgia or blame. It suggests that the narrow household may not feel heavy because modern people are weaker than the past. It may feel heavy because the older architecture around childhood has been reduced, while the child has remained fundamentally human. History changed the form of responsibility faster than evolution changed the form of the child. This does not mean small households are unreal, or unloving, or incapable of raising children. They are real, and they can be deeply meaningful. The point is more restrained and more historical than that. The two-parent household may be better understood as a later social arrangement that became dominant in many places, not as the original template around which human childhood was first designed. Once that distinction is made, many earlier parts of the argument begin to settle into place. The helpless infant, the long childhood, the labor of survival, the burden on mothers, the role of fathers, the support of grandparents and siblings, the patterns seen by anthropologists, and the quiet resistance of archaeology all begin to point in the same direction. Human childhood appears older than the household form that now often claims to contain it. That is why the modern family can feel both normal and narrow at the same time. It is normal in the sense of being historically familiar to many people now, but it may still be narrow in the longer human sense, because it compresses into a small domestic frame a kind of growing up that was shaped over immense stretches of time in wider circles of care. The household did not invent the child arrived first, carrying the deeper memory of a species that seems to have raised its young in a broader human world than two parents alone. One of the strangest features of modern family life is that it can feel both emotionally normal and physically unsustainable at the same time. Many parents love their children deeply, commit themselves fully, and still move through daily life with a quiet sense of overload. The day feels too small, the labor feels endless, the available hands feel too few. This feeling is often treated as a private problem, as though the household itself were complete, and any struggle inside it must come from weakness, poor planning, or bad luck. But when this feeling is placed against the longer history of our species, it begins to look different. The strain may not come only from individual failure. It may come from a mismatch between the kind of child humans still produce and the kind of care structure modern life now expects. The child remains recognizably human in the old sense, dependent for a long time, slow to mature, deeply responsive to social surroundings, and costly in time, attention, and emotion. What has narrowed is not the child, but the support system around the child. In much of modern life, the household is expected to function as a nearly self-sufficient unit. Even when schools, clinics, or services exist, the emotional and practical core of child-rearing is still often imagined as the responsibility of a very small number of adults, usually two, and sometimes effectively one. This expectation feels ordinary only because it has become familiar. Yet once we return to the origin of our species, the weight of that expectation begins to show. Human childhood appears to have taken shape across long stretches of time, in settings where care, labor, and social presence were broader, more people were near, more generations were visible, more tasks and forms of help could overlap. A child raised under those conditions was not easier to raise, but the burden was less likely to be locked inside one small domestic container. This is why modern exhaustion is historically interesting. It may be telling us something real about human design. A mother or father today may feel constantly divided between direct care, paid work, household maintenance, emotional regulation, and the practical demands of keeping life stable. None of these pressures are invented. They are the modern version of an older problem. Human children need much, and adult life never stops needing much at the same time. In earlier settings, that burden may have been softened, not removed, by the presence of more nearby people. In modern settings, the burden often remains concentrated. The result is not necessarily catastrophe. Often, it is simply chronic strain. This is one reason the modern two-parent ideal can feel both beautiful and heavy. It promises intimacy, stability, and clear responsibility. But it can also compress into two adults a form of labour that may once have been spread across a wider circle. The child at the centre of this arrangement has not become less socially hungry just because the household has become smaller. The need for guidance, comfort, repetition, supervision, and patient exposure to many kinds of human presence remains. When those needs are funneled mainly into one small home, the household may begin to feel like it is carrying more than it can easily hold. The beginning of our species helps illuminate this without turning it into simple nostalgia. The point is not that the past was easier. It was often much harder. The point is that the structure of care may have been wider. Hardship distributed across more people can feel different from hardship compressed into fewer. That difference matters. It may help explain why so many modern parents feel not merely tired, but enclosed. They are trying to raise a child of an old species inside a narrowed architecture of care. That does not mean the modern household is false. It means its emotional centrality may be real while its practical sufficiency remains uncertain. The household can be loving and still too small. What makes modern parenting especially revealing is that many of its hardest parts do not come from unusual crisis. They come from ordinary repetition. Meals return, laundry returns, fatigue returns, school schedules return, illness returns, emotional demands return, night waking returns. The need to earn money, maintain a home, and stay mentally steady all continue at the same time. None of this is dramatic in isolation. Yet together it creates a form of pressure that can feel constant. This constant pressure is important because it echoes something ancient. Human child rearing has likely always involved repeated interruption, repeated labour, and repeated dependence. What has changed is the width of the structure holding that pressure. In many modern settings, it is narrower than the child seems built for. The modern household often carries a hidden contradiction. It is treated as the proper place for intimacy, protection, and personal growth, yet it is also expected to perform a huge amount of practical work with relatively few adults inside it. In some cases, extended family lives nearby and softens that pressure. In many others, grandparents are distant, neighbours are socially separate, siblings are few, and work pulls adults away from the home for long hours. The child remains a child of the same species, still needing patience, repetition, emotional co-regulation, language, supervision, and social learning over many years. But the surrounding field of support has thinned. When the field thins, every need falls more directly onto fewer shoulders. This is one reason the modern household can feel both full and insufficient at once. It contains the people who matter most, yet often lacks the wider human buffer that earlier forms of life may have more commonly provided. If we return again to the beginning of our species, this begins to make sense in a deeper way. Human children did not evolve inside worlds of high privacy and low overlap. They seem to have emerged inside environments where the burdens of survival and the burdens of care were more visibly distributed. A child might still have depended most strongly on a mother and father, but those parents were rarely the only nearby adults shaping the child's day. Grandparents, siblings, kin, or other familiar people could absorb small fragments of responsibility, and those fragments mattered precisely because childhood is made of so many fragments. Modern life often strips away those fragments of help while leaving the child unchanged. The child still needs the long, patient road into adulthood. The household simply has fewer built-in ways to spread the cost. This can also help explain why so many parents describe not only exhaustion, but a strange sense of isolation even while living with those they love most. The household may be emotionally dense yet socially thin. There may be deep attachment inside it, but not enough surrounding people to make the long work of raising a child feel breathable. This does not mean that older arrangements were morally better or that all modern life is defective. It means only that the narrow household may be asked to solve a problem that human childhood did not originally pose in such a narrow way. The deeper evolutionary design of the child still points outward, toward many voices, many examples, many moments of handover, many repeated exposures to human variation. When those layers are reduced, the remaining adults do more than their share of emotional and practical holding. Seen from this angle, modern parenting difficulty becomes less mysterious. It is not only about stress, technology, money, or changing values, though all of those matter. It is also about scale. A village-sized developmental burden has, in many places, been moved into a household-sized space. The child remains slow-growing and socially demanding. The space around that child has simply become smaller. That may be why so many loving homes still carry a quiet feeling of strain. They are not failing at care. They may be carrying more of it than human childhood was ever meant to place on so few people at once. The modern household often feels complete in theory and incomplete in practice. This may be the quiet contradiction at the center of contemporary child-rearing. A family can contain love, intention, sacrifice, and devotion, yet still feel as though something important is missing from the daily mechanics of raising a child. That missing element is not always money, and not always time, though both matter. Sometimes it is simply the absence of more people, more hands nearby, more generations in view, more familiar adults who can step in, absorb pressure, model different ways of being, and keep childhood from resting so heavily on one small set of shoulders. When this absence is felt day after day, it can create a peculiar modern experience. Parents may love their children deeply and still feel that the structure around that love is too narrow. This feeling becomes more understandable when placed against the long beginning of our species. Human childhood seems to have taken shape in environments where development happened amid many relationships, not inside a tightly bounded domestic chamber. A child would still know certain people as central, but that child's actual world would be larger than a pair. There would be more eyes to notice, more voices to repeat language, more bodies nearby to interrupt danger, more examples of adult behavior, more opportunities for care to shift briefly from one person to another. These small transfers matter because childhood is built from thousands of small moments. When those moments are distributed, the burden changes shape. When they are concentrated, the burden grows dense. This may be why the modern family can feel not only tired, but sealed. It is carrying inside itself a developmental task that may once have rested in a wider human field. The child, meanwhile, still arrives with the old biological pattern intact. Slow, dependent, socially open, emotionally shaped by surrounding presence, and in need of years of guided becoming. That kind of child does not stop needing a broad world simply because society has declared a small household sufficient. The declaration may be socially powerful, but the child remains older than the declaration. This helps explain why two loving parents can still feel overmatched without having done anything wrong. The structure may simply be too thin for the species. The beginning of human life does not tell us that the past was peaceful, easy, or ideal. It tells us something more restrained and more useful. It suggests that the child was likely not meant to rely on such a small circle of daily support. Not because parents were unimportant, but because parents were probably never expected to do everything alone. Once that possibility is taken seriously, modern strain stops looking like a private weakness and starts looking like a historical compression. The household has become smaller than the developmental environment that human childhood may have originally assumed. This does not condemn the modern family, it only places it in proportion. A small household may still be loving, stable, and meaningful, but it may also be carrying a larger human burden than it appears to be carrying from the outside. That is why the title of this video continues to deepen as the argument unfolds. Humans may never have been raised by just two parents, not only because of biology, labor, or ancient living space, but because the child itself seems to belong to a wider human texture. The modern household can still hold that child with enormous care, yet the persistent feeling of overload in contemporary parenting may be one of the clearest signs that the older circle around childhood has not disappeared from our nature. It has only disappeared from view, leaving two adults to carry the outline of something that once extended much further. The deeper this question becomes, the less it sounds like an argument about family structure and the more it sounds like a question about what kind of species we are. Human beings do not simply produce children who need feeding and protection for a short time. We produce children who remain unfinished for years, children who learn slowly, imitate constantly, depend heavily on surrounding emotion, and require long exposure to language, memory, skill, and correction before they can stand securely inside adult life. That kind of childhood is not a minor feature of our species. It is one of its defining conditions. And once that condition is taken seriously, the title of this video begins to point towards something larger than the household. It begins to point toward a mismatch between the scale of human development and the scale of modern expectation. A child of our species seems to ask for more than survival. The child seems to ask for a whole human world. This is what the earlier parts of the story have been quietly building toward. The helpless infant, the long childhood, the burden on mothers, the role of fathers, the usefulness of grandparents and siblings, the evidence from anthropology, the silence of archaeology, the historical narrowing of the household, and the strain of modern parenting all lead back to one simple possibility. Human childhood may have been shaped in an environment wider than the home as many people now imagine it. Not wider in the sense of less intimate, but wider in the sense of more layered. More generations nearby, more hands available, more voices repeated over time, more opportunities for one tired adult to be relieved by another, more examples through which the child could slowly learn what human life looked like. This matters because development is not only about avoiding danger, it is also about being formed by repeated presence. The child learns what a human group is by growing inside one. When we return to the beginning of our species, this possibility feels less like theory and more like proportion. Human beings emerged in social worlds where daily survival depended on shared awareness, overlapping labor, and continued proximity. The child entering such a world would not only be attached to two central adults, the child would be calibrated by a broader arrangement of life. That does not mean every ancient group was kind, or stable, or rich in support. It means only that the scale of childhood and the scale of the surrounding group may have fit one another more closely than they often do now. This also changes the meaning of modern parental exhaustion. It suggests that the problem may not lie only in stress, economics, or cultural pressure, though all of those matter. It may also lie in the fact that the human child still carries the old shape of dependence, while the world around the child has become thinner, more private, and more compressed. The household remains emotionally central, yet the older human need for a broader field of care may still linger beneath the surface. That lingering need may be why modern family life can feel both deeply loving and persistently strained. It asks a small structure to absorb a very old developmental burden. Seen this way, the question is no longer whether two parents can love a child enough. Of course they can love deeply. The question is whether love alone was ever the full structure that human childhood rested on. Everything in the longer story suggests otherwise. The child seems to come from a species whose path to adulthood was held up not only by devotion at the center, but by human nearness all around it. And that leaves us standing before a quieter and larger thought. If human beings were shaped by a childhood wider than the household-sized world many now inherit, then perhaps the most revealing thing about modern family life is not that it feels familiar, but that it so often feels smaller than the child inside it. If a child needs a whole human world, then the central lesson of this story may not be about the past alone. It may also be about recognition. Recognition that the modern household, for all its intimacy and meaning, may not fully explain the deeper shape of human childhood. Recognition that many of the pressures felt by parents now are not random signs of weakness but echoes of an older design. Recognition that the child standing in a kitchen, sitting in a car seat, falling asleep in a small bedroom, or asking the same question for the 10th time in one evening is still, in evolutionary terms, the descendant of a being shaped in wider circles of care. This recognition does not solve the strain of modern life, but it changes the way that strain can be understood. It places it inside a much longer human story. Throughout this story, one idea has kept returning from different angles. The human infant is unusually helpless. The human child matures unusually slowly. Mothers carry heavy biological burdens. Fathers matter, but often within wider systems of support. Grandparents, siblings, and other nearby people can quietly hold up large parts of childhood. Anthropology keeps finding broader rings of care. Archaeology keeps placing children in shared worlds rather than in clearly isolated domestic units. History shows how households became narrower and more self-contained over time. Modern life reveals what that narrowing can feel like from the inside. None of these pieces alone is absolute, but together they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Human beings do not seem to come from a species whose young were meant to rely only on two adults for everything. They seem to come from a species in which childhood itself unfolded across a broader human field. That broader field is important not because it was always warm or ideal, but because it was wide enough to match the scale of the child's dependence. A child does not only need one kind of care. A child needs repeated care in many forms, across many years, from the body to the emotions to language to social memory. A small household can offer some of this with great devotion, but the total shape of human childhood still seems larger than the household alone. This is why the title of the video should finally be heard in its fullest sense. It is not saying that two parents are unimportant. It is not saying that love inside a small family is insufficient or unreal. It is saying something quieter and more historical. The child of our species may carry within its long development the expectation of more surrounding life than two adults can easily provide by themselves. Not more love in the abstract, but more human presence, more overlap, more handovers, more examples, more generational depth, more practical relief, and more continuity of care across time. The beginning of our species still matters even here, at the end. The earliest humans could not have known what a modern nuclear family was, but they did know what it meant to survive near others, to learn near others, to age near others, and to raise the young amid the constant nearness of a group. From that long perspective, the child looks less like the possession of a private household, and more like the fragile center of a wider human arrangement. That arrangement has changed many times. It has narrowed, stretched, fragmented, and reassembled across history, yet the child remains recognizably old, slow to finish, open to influence, hungry for patient repetition, built, perhaps, for more voices than one home can easily contain. And so the final thought does not arrive as a hard conclusion, but as a softer question left open in the dark. If human childhood was shaped for a wider circle than the one many people now inherit, then what, exactly, does a fully human childhood still remember, even when the world around it has grown smaller? Perhaps the most valuable thing this long question gives back to us is not a rule about how every family should live, but a clearer sense of proportion. Human beings are a species with unusually slow children, unusually long dependency, and an unusually deep need to learn through other people. That is not a failure in our design. It is one of the reasons our species became capable of language, memory, cooperation, teaching, and culture. But every strength in evolution carries a cost. In our case, the cost may have been that childhood was never a small project. It was never only about feeding one body until it could survive alone. It was about holding open a long period of becoming, a long period in which the young required not only protection, but repeated human presence. Once that is understood, the title of this video no longer sounds extreme. It begins to sound like a quiet description of the kind of creature a human child has always been. Not a child built for instant independence. Not a child easily contained inside a narrow structure of care, but a child shaped by long exposure to many people, many ages, many rhythms of work, memory, and guidance. The deeper lesson in that is not that the past was better. The past was often harsher, more fragile, and more uncertain than the present, nor is the lesson that love inside a small family is somehow incomplete. It is real, powerful, and often extraordinary. The lesson is something gentler and more useful. It is that many of the pressures surrounding childhood today may make more sense when we remember that the human child comes from a much older world than the modern household. A child may still carry needs that were once met by a broader field of human nearness. That memory may remain in the structure of development itself, in the long dependence, the hunger for repetition, the need for many examples, and the deep sensitivity to surrounding presence. This is where the educational value of the story finally rests. It asks us to be careful with what we call natural. What feels familiar in one era may not be ancient in the life of a species. The two-parent household may be meaningful, but meaning is not the same as origin. If we confuse the arrangement we know best with the arrangement that shaped us most deeply, we risk misunderstanding both childhood and ourselves. The longer history of humanity suggests something more modest and more humane. Children have often needed more than a pair, and adults have often depended on one another more than modern life likes to admit. That does not tell us exactly how to rebuild the world. It does not erase variation between cultures, households, or personal histories, but it does offer one clear form of wisdom. Human life becomes easier to understand when we stop imagining individuals as self-made and start noticing how much of growth has always depended on surrounding care. In that sense, this story is not only about children, it is also about adults, memory, and the quiet structure of human responsibility. We do not become human alone, and perhaps we were never meant to imagine that we could. The educational message, then, is simple enough to carry forward. To understand a child honestly, we must understand the wider human circle that makes childhood possible. To understand the strain of family life honestly, we must remember that love is real, but love has always needed support. And to understand our species honestly, we must admit that human beings were shaped not only by parents, but by generations standing near one another, carrying forward more of life than any two people could hold by themselves. If that is true, then perhaps the quiet question left at the end is not only how children were once raised, but whether the human story has always been telling us the same thing in a softer voice, that the deepest parts of life were never meant to be carried alone,